Going live in 3, 2, 1, and hey, we're live. Hey everyone. Thanks for checking out my video about website performance optimization mostly on the front end, but we're going to talk about the back end too. If you've seen any of my other videos, you may know I've been building a desktop environment in the browser for quite a while now, and this year, 2022, I've kind of been focusing on performance tuning whenever I've had time. So in this video, I'll use real-world examples of what I've been doing with my app, which is also my website, dustinbrett.com. So feel free to check it out. And yeah, with that, let's just jump into my website and take a look at it here. So this is my website. It's open right now. I got DevTools open as well, so we can kind of look through what's going on as we discuss all the different tips. I think I've got in the title here 25 tips, and it's not an arbitrary number. I kind of just wrote down all my different ideas and then organized them and subcategories and all that stuff, and there ended up being about 25 of them. So I figured, hey, I'll put that. So as clickbaity as the title or thumbnail may look, I'll take it serious, and we'll just go through it like developer to developer, and let's just kind of see what I've done here and how it's worked out. So yeah, so this is my website. This is the desktop environment in the browser. We'll close DevTools for a second here, and I can just show you it a little bit. So if you refresh here, feels pretty snappy. I mean, you could say, hey, it's cached there, so we could clear the cache, right-click and empty cache. You can see it still loads pretty quick. It's saying here about 300 milliseconds. Results will like vary. I actually have a pretty quick internet connection as well, but we'll kind of get into how I can even get close to that speed and what some of the things are that I'm doing to get there. So yeah, let's jump into that. I've also got a list here. We'll jump into my VS Code is where I've decided to put the list in a little markdown file. And here's basically the 25 items. We're going to go through them all here. I've organized them numerically and into the kind of the back end, the server side, and then we're going to go over to the client side. But for whatever reason, and they're not necessarily ordered in like, this is the best, from top to bottom kind of thing. I tried to do a little bit of that, like let's get through the interesting stuff at the top. But in general, there's little nuggets all over the place, so maybe you can feel free to jump around. I'll try to add some little bookmarks to the video after the stream so it's easier to view them. Also, before I get into it too, I wanted to say hi to Ken J. Web Dev, who posted earlier in the day that he said, can't wait to see this. So thank you. Hopefully you enjoy the video here. So yeah, let's just continue on. First thing, so CDN. Basically, CDN is like a content delivery network, and the one that I have chosen is from a company called Cloudflare, and we're just going to open it up here and take a look at what they've got. So this is all going to depend. Let's just one more caveat before we get into it here, moving into the list here. So all these tips are going to depend on what your website's like. If you've got like some kind of fancy backend, you've got when the page loads, you need after that, then you need a bunch of information, or for whatever reason you want to spend a bunch of money, then you might want to do things a little bit differently. Most of what I've done is free. It's for someone who's hosting a website that's basically static code. So I'm doing pretty much nothing in the back end other than serving HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, you would say, but I'm actually not serving any CSS, and we'll get into what I'm doing there. But that's the basics of it, is that I'm just serving static files that you could do with any kind of web server. But so if you have a more complicated setup, I will most of these tips apply to everybody, but we'll go through them and you can kind of see the differences and how it's going to be more useful for a static website, some of these tips. So back to Cloudflare. So this is a really interesting company, I'd say. If we go over to their pricing here, you can see their they have a free option that fits a lot of people. And if you happen to fit into the paid one, then I think the paid one's pretty reasonable too. But some of the important things that they'll do that I use are the ability for DNS. So like dustinbrett.com. Before, I used to have my DNS being hosted by the same people that are hosting the actual files themselves, which is a company called StableHost. Let me just see. I never even look at them barely. But StableHost, they're just some generic host I just happen to have from many years ago. There's a million of them out here, these resellers. It's just a place to put files. You could also host it on your own through like AWS or any of the many cloud services that also have free plans where you can kind of dump some static files. That's just what I happen to have. But the CDN, the content delivery network, Cloudflare in this case, getting in the middle of that, of what you have, where you put your files and your users accessing your files, that's where this is really important. So on the DNS side, that's something I noticed like about a year and a half ago when I actually shared my website, and basically people couldn't access it. They would try to go to dustinbrett.com. The DNS provider would say, okay, for dustinbrett.com, StableHost knows who that is, they're in charge of the IP address for that, basically, and they would just have problems giving that information. So the people that are saying, dustinbrett.com, where is that? StableHost is like, I don't know, dude, I'm timed out, or something to that extent, basically. So it was a failure. I moved my DNS over to Cloudflare, which is a very simple process, still using StableHost for the files. So now when I put the files on there, basically, if a user goes to my dustinbrett.com, Cloudflare is the one that tells them this is where they are, and depending if Cloudflare has them cached already, it considers that what's called a hit, where it already has a cached item for it, and then it'll just serve that directly from Cloudflare. And in the case of Cloudflare and these CDNs, when it serves it, it's typically going to do it from one of these edges, they call it. So once they cache the file, they kind of distribute it over their network, which has puts your file in many different locations closer to where your users are, versus what I have with StableHost, where my files are just literally in one place. I don't know where it is, probably somewhere in the States, but that's just where it is. So when you first go to my file and you get a miss, let's say, where the Cloudflare hasn't seen that file yet, the first time it's going to have to go to StableHost to get it, and you're going to have a slower experience. We'll get into how I have to deal with that. That's like one of the little caveats that you kind of have to consider, but it's pretty minor anyways. But yeah, that's one little piece with CDNs that's kind of important to get into. And speaking more on Cloudflare, they actually have a pretty good article about optimizing site speed. And this gets into just in general with CDNs, is that whatever your CDN is, it's going to have some different speed optimization settings. In this case, it's got quite a few good ones here that we're actually going to go into more detail about. I'm kind of half cheating, I guess, but some of these are also points that are in my 25 points thing. So we'll go into this a little bit, but basically these things are important. I've listed them. They aren't necessarily enabled by default on Cloudflare. Some of them are, perhaps more of them now. When I got the account a while ago, and I've since then had to enable some of them, but perhaps if you created the account, some of them are default on. I don't know. Some of these happen to be like the compression that's used when the file is given to the user. This auto minification, this is kind of hit and miss. I found that it actually made some of the files bigger, and it kind of made things weirder. Same with Rocket Loader. So those are you got to kind of play around with that a little bit. I would say all of these tips, it's like mileage may vary. I mean, some of them perhaps not. We'll get through. Some of them are just like very much, if you can do this, it will be good. But in general, you got to test, and you got to see if it's going to be good for you. So just like take these tips with a grain of salt, I guess, in that way. But yeah, let's say this Rocket Loader for me was eh. Same with Auto Minify. Auto Minify, I believe I'm doing for the JavaScript. I'm not even sure. If it can squeeze another 1% out of it, I think I just allow it. But at one point, I think I did that, and it was actually causing an issue. But it ended up being, I don't even know what it was, honestly. But again, mileage may vary. This is important. HTTP 2.3. This will be my next point, in fact. This Polish and Mirage. These are things where these are like the upsells from a CDN where they offer free things. Same with, I think, Rocket Loader and not Auto Minify. But I think there's like premium versions of some of these settings. So it's like you could always do a little bit better. And that gets into this bigger one, which is this Argo Smart Routing. This one here says paid add-on, but I think Polish and Mirage to some point have some paid level to them. I might be wrong on that. But this Argo one is where if I had infinite money, or if I was like, hey, I just want my site to go faster, this is another little thing I could do where I could pay for the CDN to essentially give me premium service on their already quite good network, which is much better than StableHost, which I'm using for just putting the files on there, the dump truck. And there's a bunch of other settings in here. We won't get into all these. Most of these are actually not as relevant as these ones are, these one-click optimizations. These are the ones that are just very simple and obvious, that if you're using Cloudflare, or if whatever CDN you happen to be using, it might make sense. I'm going to take a moment here to take a sip of my Monster Ultra Fiesta Mango. I thought the Ultra was a good match for these extreme speed that we're trying to get out of the website today. So cheers to that. It's also 10:40 p.m. and where I am, so I'm trying to kind of keep awake to get through these, because I need to explain these. I want to. So I think where does that get us for the CDN? I think that's pretty clear for the CDN. There's other options out there. I'm not really going to discuss them, to be honest, because I'm mostly talking about real-world examples. On that note, let's get to the real-world examples then. So let's look at my code here. So when we go to the page, so the files that I've already essentially generated them previously, put them via, I used FTP to get them onto stable host server, and then I went to my website to essentially do the first request where they become misses, just where Cloudflare first gets to see them and says, hey, these are new files. And another way that I need Cloudflare to do that is I actually go into Cloudflare's settings and purge my cache. This gets into something that we'll discuss too, where you can have certain headers where you say, when the user sees this file request, I want you to cache this for 7 days or 30 days or however many days. I'm doing 7 days right now because I change it so often, but I think typically they'll recommend a little more, maybe even 30 days. It's not a bad idea if you can do it, but like I say, I just always purge cache anyways when I want to update it, and then I'll get all those misses, and I kind of warm up the files by just visiting them so Cloudflare can get them in their cache and then kind of distribute them in their edge network. To that extent, let's kind of get into it. So the first request that happens is right at the top here. So this is if you want to look at these things when you go to any website, you can press F12, or depending on what your browser is, there's going to be some kind of dev tools or dev experience. Often you can get to it just from right-clicking a web page and pressing inspect. That'll get you to like something like this elements piece where you inspect these pieces, and then from there you'll have a tab where you can kind of look at the network. So let's say in this case I've got cache disabled, so whenever this is open, there's no caching. I can go even further and then right-click on the refresh here and do, oh, it doesn't show in my streaming, but it shows 3 options, and the bottom one being empty cache and hard reload, which I feel more confidence, like, okay, the files are definitely fresh, you know. So on that note, these came right from the server. So the first request, Dustin Brett, you'll see here in the response headers that it has come from Cloudflare. That's the CF cache status as a hit. And I've got this, you see here what I was talking about the cache control header. This is I believe this is in seconds. It might be a week, I think 7 days in seconds. And this is what I'm talking about too, about the edges. I'm not sure exactly what this CF Ray header means, but I noticed here this YVR, that happens to be the airport code near where I live. So my thinking on that is that it's probably using that edge network, detecting from my IP address that it's like, hey, let's serve it to him from the YVR server that we call it. Could be wrong on that. This content encoding, this BR, that's getting to that Brotli encoding. Another option is GZip, but that's one of the tips that I have, is that we should move away from GZip towards Brotli. That's been recommended for quite a while now, and that's in most ways Brotli's considered the successor. We can quickly see some links to see that that's considered the case in some circles at least. What are some other relevant tags here? Some of these are just from Cloudflare. I don't really know what these are. Yeah, I don't really question these. Server, Cloudflare, turbocharged by Lightspeed. And some of the other cool features it has, so let's say stable host. If I were to just serve this directly from stable host, I believe it serves it over HTTP 1.1, maybe HTTP 2. I don't think so, honestly. But because it's going through Cloudflare, it can be served on a more modern protocol, basically is what it's called. So for whatever reason, the main page still uses the HTTP 2 protocol, which I'm okay with. But for all the assets, at least, it's using the HTTP 3 protocol. So if you see here, it'll say H3. And you get some advantages. Basically, from 2 and 3, you get advantages over the 1.1. Something called like multiplexing, where it can do multiple requests. This can also make it a lot less useful to do something like sprite maps. If people know, for making images, there used to be tricks back in the day where you would essentially make one big image that had all the little pieces, and then you would make a text, like a CSS file that says, this piece is this icon, this piece is this icon. The idea being that you would only serve one file that's an image, and it would just be a little bit faster based on that, because of the way HTTP 1 was only allowing, I believe, 6 requests at a time. But that's kind of been eliminated now with HTTP 2 and HTTP 3 as well. I believe HTTP 3, if I have it in my notes here, I have a little comparison here. We can just jump to the link. I believe one of the key factors is that it's using a different networking protocol. Instead of TCP, which is with HTTP 2, it's using this quick protocol, which I believe is using UDP, which is slightly different. I'm not going to get into the details of that because it's a slightly above my head, or just some points it is. I mean, I would step over myself definitely if I tried to explain it to any high degree. But needless to say, I think there's quite a bit of documentation to prove that it usually is going to improve performance. I don't want to jump into any numbers here, but I would recommend trying it. So that's one thing that's quite ideal about using this CDN, is that they support HTTP 3. So that these serve quite quick. And I think that's about it as far as the CDN and the things that I get from it. We'll see if we can discuss more down the road. But let's jump on to whatever the next point happens to be, which I think probably we just discussed. Yeah, this is about the HTTP 2 and 3. So that is a key point, is that to be able to serve it at HTTP 3, that's important. One thing I was looking at in my research was this thing called Open Light Speed. I think that might be one to look at here. Open Light Speed. Let me get rid of the HTTP 3 part. But in general, it seemed a bit tricky, to be honest. Like, I was looking for web servers that you yourself could host that did HTTP 3. It looked like one web server called Nginx has some a beta ability to do that. Also, there was this Lightspeed could do it. I'm not sure about Open Lightspeed, but there's a server called Lightspeed. You saw it in the Cloudflare headers. I think Cloudflare is providing that. And the Lightspeed web server was one of the first, I believe, to do HTTP 3. I think they talk about it here in the comparisons here. Do they? It's somewhere in here. Yeah, they mention it here about servers that have that ability. I believe there's like a preview for Nginx, Cloudflare. So that's another advantage you get. IIS perhaps has some support for it in Server 2022. So it's quite new. Oh, yeah, I thought I might be cutting it off there, but now I see I wasn't. Anyways, so like a lot of these things I'm talking about too, they're not going to be for the most modern browsers. We'll get into that point as well, but essentially I mean, it depends if you're trying to sell to the widest possible market, then you're going to want to support the Internet Explorers of the world and the ECMAScript 5, the ES5 JavaScript, which is requires you to either write less modern code or do some transposization with your transpiling. I'm not sure if it's called transposization. That sounds wrong. But essentially, you have to convert your JavaScript to an older version so that you can support these older browsers. That's something that I'm kind of done with, at least with my website. So we'll get into it with some of the features I'm discussing here, where there's a website called caniuse.com that'll show you all the different browsers and what they support. And there's kind of a little section of browsers over the last two versions of Firefox, Chrome, whatever it happens to be. And that's kind of my sweet spot for support. And that's why that's where a lot of these features are gonna give you the best performance. And that's the browser I'm using to show you this is able to support HTTP 3 and all the new features that we're gonna go over. You see here with the priority here where it's able to, you have high and highest. I've been able to have some control over increasing the priority here, but that's something that some browsers wouldn't be able to detect the settings that I've used, and we'll get into that. Okay, let's move on to the next thing in the list here. What's next? So the Brotli compression, we discussed that as well. We'll get into it. Let's take a little peek at this link about it, just to kind of see the gist of it. So yeah, this Brotli compression, if you see here, I believe, is developed by Google, a successor to GZip, which is, as we said, was one of the other ones. And in general, it's just considered better. It looks like it's supported by 94% of the browsers here, they're saying. I can let you, I mean, do your own research on that, but I think there might even be something newer. I'm not sure if there is, but Brotli still is pretty popular. It seemed to be what Cloudflare was supporting. So another one that we've kind of discussed slightly was HTTP headers, and in that regard, cache control. That's where you want to make sure you're telling the user that every request they're getting, yes, you can cache this. You don't have to go back to the server every time, you know, until I tell the server, invalidate those type of requests so that the browser will know it needs to go and get a new version. That's the kind of control I prefer with it, and that's why I typically set these cache control headers. This gets into how to do it within Cloudflare, but you're gonna always have your own way to do it, and you can typically set it at the level of like stable host for me of where you put the files, and then Cloudflare can infer, I believe that. Don't quote me on that, but it's definitely something you want to be aware of, is setting these headers. And on that note, actually, I'm not sure it's mentioned here, but Cloudflare by default did not cache everything. And there's some controversy if you look at the articles as to, do you cache everything, do you don't? Currently I am. With the free version you get a couple page rules, as they call them, and I've essentially done a page rule where I say for every request I want this cache header. Because before it was a little particular, and there's some rules basically, but you can bypass that with this page rule and just say, I want to cache everything. But on that note, actually too, you have to be careful, because on the stable host side, on my host side, some of the files that it would send to Cloudflare, it was giving the wrong content type in the header because it didn't know what they were. So I had to actually go onto my server, whatever yours happens to be. In this case, I could do it through Stable Host, and I think they're using Apache. and I had to say for, I believe it was like .ini files, .ini I was serving, it was calling that some like octet stream, and it just didn't know how to parse it correctly, so it wasn't getting cached properly or compressed. And I had to go in there and say, this is just plain text HTML, or just plain text actually in this case, and then it's treated it proper. So that's another thing you have to kind of be aware of. The best way to do that, I find, is just kind of when you go to your site. I mean, in this case, this is where I also get into have less requests, ideally. In this case, I have 33 requests, and you can just kind of go through them and see when you look at these hits here, did something miss, basically? Were any of these misses? Was Cloudflare unable to cache this? And then once you find it, you can kind of go over that. In this case, I think I'm getting mostly hits. There might be some misses, and there are probably reasons for them, but looks like for the most part these are hits. Yeah, looks like everything was a hit there. And it kind of shows because it was pretty quick, and Cloudflare is one of the quicker CDNs, and it's interesting that they're free because they also happen to be one of the better ones, I find. But that's perhaps opinionated. I'm not sure. I don't have any statistics for that. Oh, that's actually this point here. I had the point in regards to the types. I have a link for it, MIME types. That's what I was talking about. So you see these MIME types here. If there's something called an octet, I think. Octet stream. Essentially an unknown one here. This was wrong. So you got to watch out that if somehow the content type is this, then it's possible one of the servers did not know what it was. And it's better for you to go in and say, no, this file, this type, at least is this, because then that'll fix that. Not always, but anyways. Let's move on here. Where are we here? Early hints. This is a tricky one. This one is something that I've played with and I wasn't able to implement. It's only as of Chrome, I think 103. But I'm pretty sure they're just going to keep moving forward with it. It's going to be part of Chromium. I think it's going to get into Edge and Opera and any of the other Chromium browsers. So I definitely wanted to mention it. It's also something that's supported by Cloudflare. And it's pretty interesting. Basically, if you already have these link preloads, we'll get into these shortly. But you set up these headers within your HTML that says, I want these files to load in advance. Now, this new system, it goes above and beyond that, and essentially can take those links, and you have to put them in the HTTP headers, the same place you're putting the cache control and that kind of thing. You put this formatted link header that says, at the level of the first request, already it knows, before it's even parsed the content of your request, just from the headers it knows, oh, okay, this document is also associated with whatever it happens to be, CSS files, images, more JavaScript. I'll also go ahead and grab those as well. So it's interesting that way, but the trick to it is that it's a two-piece process. Essentially, you have to have these headers, at least for Cloudflare to make it work. You have to have these headers, and then Cloudflare has to support it on their end, because they essentially send these from the server to the browser. So when the browser makes its initial request to dustinbrett.com, it would recognize that, oh, okay, well, I know dustinbrett.com has some preload early hints that I can send to browsers that support it. And it knows that this browser happens to support it based on its request headers, perhaps. It will send a 103, which is like a different kind of HTTP message to say, hey, go grab these, before you've even looked at the HTML. Trust me, you're going to want these. And apparently it can add like 30%. I mean, there's some good articles where it sounds interesting. It sounds like, yeah, why not? Like these are new articles. This is from June 23rd. This is from like weeks ago. So it's still pretty new. It's like fresh off the presses, I'd say. I try to follow some of these blogs. And like I say, I haven't been able to implement it yet. I'll get into why in a second. Because I have these link preload headers. This kind of talks about it here. You see here it sends a 103 versus like a 200 or whatever. Here's a 200. Okay, the HTTP codes you're familiar with. There's these 103s, and this is the link header. So in this case, it's a CSS file that it's saying I want to preload that. So at the level of when it's first requested that main file, it hasn't even looked at the HTML, but because of that link header, it knows, okay, I'll just go grab this too. That's the basic idea. So the reason why, wait, there's also one Cloudflare article I want to just show you on it, because that's where I think they kind of make the claim that it's like faster. Maybe they don't make the claim here. There's a blog post where they're like 30% faster. Here's the blog post. Maybe it's this one. Yeah, 30%. Go to the top. Load times by 30%. It seems to be legit because conceptually it sounds pretty good. Here's a nice little diorama, whatever you call this, graph. This is a thing showing it, and it's basically what I kind of explained there. It just sounds great, but it has to be supported on the server. And to get into why I couldn't do it is that my link headers don't just support one image. I'm using the image source set prop within the link headers that allows me to specify different images depending on the resolution of the device that you're accessing the site on. It's just another form of responsive images with this also with preload. But it's not supported yet by these early hints. You basically have to say, just go get this file. So if I say, go get the small image, and then they go to my website, and it turns out that they have a high DPI, a high dots per inch, or no, not dots per inch, pixel ratio, essentially. They have a higher pixel ratio. Let's say my phone, it's like a 3x pixel ratio. So it wants to get a bigger image, but it already grabbed that smaller image because that's what I had in the header. So it just wasted time. So essentially it becomes opposite of an optimization because it still has to go get the other image to show the higher resolution. Anyways, that's not supported yet as far as I can see. I posted in Cloudflare's discussion forum and they didn't have any answer for me yet in regards to that. So I've kind of gone over this, so after you purge your cache, let's say you update your files, you update your files basically. You're gonna, whoever goes to the site next time, it's gonna get a bunch of misses instead of hits because Cloudflare hasn't seen these new files since it purged its cache. Typically, what I'll do after I purge cache is I go to my website and I go do a bunch of stuff, just so that Cloudflare can see somebody requesting them and it knows where to go. Because Cloudflare doesn't, it's not like using like a Google Spider robot type of thing and going over your site. Especially my site, it's really not accessible that way at the moment. I mean, I have it's not related to this video, but I have a few files like robots.txt or sitemap XML to help the robots kind of look around, but still it's not ideal. One other tip in the back end before we start moving into the front end, although I've been kind of hinting at the front end back and forth, is this is just another one I happen to think of as HSTS. This is something I set recently, and it actually is kind of interesting. It's not, I don't know if it's an optimization necessarily. I think it is. It's basically some headers that you add to your request, and also then you can go to this website and essentially put your domain on a preload list to say to every browser that has this list with these domains on it, that whenever you go here, don't think about redirects. Whatever they typed in, go to the HTTPS secure version. And that can help sometimes because if they happen to go to the HTTP version, I have something on my server that'll go to StableHost, say, you're in the wrong place, you need to go to the HTTPS version, and then redirect them. But essentially, that's a waste of time. So by signing up for this HSTS and saying, you essentially tell Google or whoever, I think Google runs this list, that yes, my domain is going to only serve through the secure HTTPS. So just put that on your browser that whenever anyone goes to that site, don't even try to go to the non-secure one. It's just not going to work. And you can also set an expiry. I think I might have set one of 1 year for this specific header. And yeah, that's it. So after 1 year, you could perhaps change it. I mean, anyone who's visited your site and seen this header would have to wait, or is going to wait 1 year before they check again to see, is that still his policy or has he gone non-secure now? So I don't have any intention of ever going back to HTTP only for the protocol. The one that doesn't require like an SSL certificate where the user doesn't have a secure experience. The certificates are free. They're generated from my backend from that StableHost company. It just automatically generates them. I think Cloudflare can automatically generate it too. So they're free anyways. It's just better to be on HTTPS. That I suppose you could say is also a tip, is just use HTTPS. It's just better. It's just going to be faster. It's just preferred by browsers. They're not going to go pop up that little red thing that says you're not secure, that kind of thing. Okay, so I think we've discussed the backend. There's all the tips for the backend. That's the first 7. And let's get into the front end here. Let's get into some client tips, and let's get into what I was talking about here with these link preload headers. So if we go to my website here, I'm using these, I wouldn't say heavily, but for the first few files here, I have these link preload headers. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. And essentially these are associated with the 5 images that I had set up to be preloaded. So what I do in my build process is I scan the desktop folder as is known on build, that what are the things that are going to be on the desktop for a fresh build. They're in these cases these 4 icons. I check these 4 icons, and I also add the shortcut icon, this little shortcut thing. That's an additional one, but I know that there's shortcuts. So I just say, hey, you know, preload the shortcut. It's going to be important. It's going to be used. So that one's static, but the 4 other icons are dynamic that are preloaded at build time. And then they get generated into these 5 link headers. And these link headers have a few special elements that I'd like to get into. One of them is actually a second tip. So we'll jump over fetch priority for a second because this can be used in a few places. And we'll talk about that image source set as well. This also will be talked about in another place, another tip about responsive images. But this is one place where you can use it, is at the link header level. This again is a new feature, as is fetch priority. But on the link headers, when you're setting them at this, if you see this rel attribute, this kind of says that the link header in this case is a preload. And I have other ones here. Let's go to the link type page that I have in the URL, and we can look at them here. So this link element has many different types it can be. But the ones that we care about from a performance point of view are the pre ones, typically. In this case, preconnect, a little bit, yeah. Prefetch, I would say no. Prefetch, I'd say, is like the old one, and I'd say preload is the more modern one that has more control. That's the way that I like to think about it, at least. And in regard to the preload one, let me copy another URL here. We have the type here, so you can see here that type is also used with preload. So in my case here, what I'm saying with type is I say for WebP. So this preload will only work if the browser supports WebP. Now, typically, if the browser supports preloading, they're going to support the WebP image format. But there's other ones you could use here. Like, let's say if you wanted to also do preloading on the new AVIF format. Not every browser that supports preloading also supports the AVIF format of images. So you could have another preload header that says, if they support this, then do this one instead. Although, actually, I don't think there's an instead. It might preload the AVIF and the WebP one. I'm not sure on that, to be honest. That's where it gets a little bit muddy about these responsive images, is if you want to use multiple modern formats and have it be responsive but only have it pick one image, then it can be a little trickier to do with some of the headers that the way they are right now on some of the browsers. At least that's been my experience. But in regards to the preload one, you get a few fancy things. So the image source set, this essentially is what I was saying about the DPI, the pixels, the resolution. So it's, in this case, it's one string. I'll show you in different responsive images how it can be different elements. But in the one string format, it's a little less controlled. And the first string is kind of the fallback one. This is just the generic resolution, or 1x. And then I've got another URL here that ends with space 2x. And then I've got a comma to separate them, space 3x. So this kind of covers the 3 different resolutions. And that's most devices. Like, this is an observation I made when I was on my S21 phone, is that it tries to get a higher quality image. I noticed this when I did a scan once with a tool for testing speed called Lighthouse, and it said, you know, like, you should serve higher quality images. Your phone wants a higher DPI, basically. And once I figured out how to do these responsive images, I noticed, like, oh yeah, the image, it looks a lot nicer. So essentially on my phone, like this icon here, let's say this my PC icon. Here on the desktop, it's 1x resolution, and that is a 48x by 48x icon, 48 height by 48 width pixels. But on my phone, that same icon, even though its visible width is 48 by 48, the browser knows that, hey, I should try to request something that's 3 times as big. And that's where you can do this 3x, and I essentially serve a 144 by 144. And it takes that and puts it into that small resolution because of the way that their pixel resolution works on the phone, and it just looks a lot more crisp. It's a little, I would say it's not a performance optimization per se, because it actually downloads a larger file in some cases. But let's say if you always wanted to serve the larger file just in case of the resolution, then in this case, this is a performance optimization to say, well, I'll use the responsive image syntax, and then if they only have 1x resolution, they'll get the smaller image, and that'll be faster. And then, yeah, if we look in the list here, I think the next thing is fetch priority. So let's jump into fetch priority. Oh, I wanted to talk about this one other piece here. Let's jump into fetch priority, and then I'll remind myself to talk about this. But fetch priority is another piece that's another new one. I don't know if I think it's Chrome 101 where they added that. Don't quote me on that. At least at the link header level, that's my remembering of it. But fetch priority is another way to kind of tell the browser that these are important. I want you to grab these as soon as possible. These aren't like good to nice to haves. These are, I'm about to load this in some form. And I've decided to do that in these cases because I know these icons on a user fresh visiting my site, which is 99% of the people that are going to see my site, they're going to want these icons because they're going to not have changed anything on the desktop. That's one little caveat, I guess, is that if you go in, my site's very customizable, so you can go in and just like fake delete this stuff. And now if I reload the page next time, there's nothing. But it still ran the preload headers, so it'll actually say in the console that, hey, there's 5 preload headers that I never really used. So that's like bad because you just made me download 5 images that you never needed. But that's not your typical use case, and you can just kind of reset that so you get the images again, and then it's not going to complain in the console because it used them properly. And you can see here that as soon as it loads the page, these 5 images have loaded right after that, even though they aren't needed until down here they're actually used, the WebP images. So that's one of the advantages you get with that. And you see they all loaded very fast. They're all pretty small. We'll get into why they're small too, and some optimizations there. So that's the idea of fetch priority, and fetch priority actually has a few different flavors. I'm using it in a few different places. I don't think it's visible in any relevant places here other than in the link headers. But if you look at this web dev article where they've kind of added it, because again, it's another recent one. This is from March of this year. It's been added in a few places. So if you're familiar with the fetch API command in the browser, so if I open up a DevTools here and I go to console, you can actually type in fetch here and fetch something, some kind of item. Let's say I can do a wait here. I'm actually putting an empty URL, so I don't know what'll happen. Yeah, so it actually just tried to fetch, I don't know, itself or something. But you can do requests this way, and essentially with fetch priority, it adds the ability to have this priority field. This thing doesn't even know how to autocomplete it. But you could say, let's say low there. Oh, I see I didn't use a comma here. Let me fix that. So there we go, and that does a low priority. And if we look here, so it actually did it there, low priority. So that's a new thing. I have a newer version of Chrome, but I've gone in and in the few places where I wanted to use the fetch API, none of them for me, I believe, were on load, but perhaps for you they might be, and you might really want that request to happen right away. Then this is another thing you can do where you can say fetch priority, and you can set it to high now, and then it'll make sure that it's going to do it high. In this case, it's the default too, I believe, in some cases, but there's times when it's not, or the browser deprioritizes it if you don't specify it. So there's an opportunity to specify it within fetch. And I think it's also on the image tag as well, and link. So let's just go to the next piece that I remember in the list, which was this piece that I wanted to go over, right? The dynamic preloading. So preloading doesn't just have, the link headers and preloading doesn't just have to be on load. I mean, most of what we're discussing here is about the fast website on load, but another fast piece is when I open my start menu here. I want it that, I know the icons that are going to be shown on a default user opening the start menu. So another thing that I've done is on hover of the start button that's down here. We'll get to it in a second. I'm going to clear the network request here so this list is empty. And you'll see that when I hover the mouse over the start button, in anticipation of the user clicking it, I've done another scan at build time to know these are the things that are going to be in the start menu. So if they hover over the start button, in the time it takes for them to actually click it, start getting those images because I want to have them as smooth as possible. So as you see there, it downloaded those 12 images pretty quickly. It did it at low priority. I would have preferred it did it at higher priority. Maybe I should set fetch priority for those. The way that I did it basically is just through DOM manipulation, and essentially go document.head, and I just append them to the head element. So you'll see here at the bottom of the head element, that's where they've all been put in. And yeah, I didn't put fetch priority. I guess it doesn't really matter, but I feel like it might. So I might actually want to set that myself. I'll make a note of that. Let's make a note of that together because it's always fun to make notes. This is the way that I kind of catch a lot of things and just keep iterating over things is actually writing down the things that I forget to do. So why was this low? And I won't actually put this in the notes, but it's a good question for myself, so it's better to write it somewhere. And it's a good tip to just write down these things. Actually, that's probably a good tip for performance optimizations, is when you notice any little thing where it's like, oh, did it just hesitate? It's like, write that down maybe. And if all of a sudden you notice it's happening multiple times, these edge cases are like, that's how you catch them, essentially, is just by catching them. Because it can be easy to ignore them. Sometimes I'll take months and then I'll notice like, oh yeah, that is slow. Like I've just been ignoring that for months. but why is that slow? And then I look into it and it's like, oh, this should be like that. And then it's like 10 times faster. All right. That's an exaggeration, but double the speed can happen from something like a flip sometimes, where you're like, this should happen first because then it would show it and then figure this out. And that's like another just like casual tip with the code is like try to find those opportunities where how can I do the thing that updates the DOM, the document, like the browser, the thing the user sees? How can I make that happen first and then the other things? Because a lot of times with code, I notice this in some pull requests or the code I review is people will just put things in some order. It's like all these things need to happen. But the fact is, like, that can be 200, 300 milliseconds of things happening. And you don't care what order it is, but from the user's point of view, if you put this up here, visually it happened 300 milliseconds faster to them, even though by the time they click it, another 300 milliseconds occurred and all of your requests happened. But it's better than all of your requests happening and then the user seeing it, because the user's not going to see it, and then typically they're not going to click it within 300 milliseconds. I mean, depends how fast they are, if there's some gamer or something, but anyways, I prefer to just show them as soon as possible. So it puts them in here. That's just another little lesson that you can do is preloads. Just if you know users are typically going to go to something, let's say it's a hamburger menu, those little triple line menus. That's another preload you can do. You might want to not do it on load, but let's say you do a preload with a little buffer even. So even if their mouse goes 100 pixels close to that hamburger menu, just start getting the images, you know? I mean, it's a cheap operation, especially if let's say it's 20 icons, and then when they open that hamburger menu, rather than some jankiness or something, or taking a second, the images are basically there already. So that's another tip. Let's close these. Let's take a sip, and then I want to read a chat message I got here. So let's take another sip of my Ultra Fiesta Mango. And just for health, I'm going to chase it with some water. Oh, delicious. So we got a message here from Profil. Hi, Dustin. Big fan of your videos. I'm from Sydney now. Watched most of your older videos. Wow, thank you. It's glad to see you here. I hope you like this video. I'm trying to do some content that's helpful to everybody and not just always about things involving my desktop environment. Well, I guess this is, but these things are hopefully applicable to everybody. And I found them that they've helped my performance. So let's move on because I don't remember where I was in that last point. Yeah, so I've gone through this. I went through fetch priority. Now we get into a whole other bag of worms, HTML minification, and also tag removal. For that, I actually have a little bit of code where I run in my scripts here. We'll get into this a little bit more, but basically in my package JSON, this gets into, like in my case, I'm using Next.js, but you could be using whatever, Angular, or however you've decided to build a front end. Typically, you're going to have some kind of framework or some kind of way to put it together. Often, you're going to have something called Webpack, which is a method of taking all the little code and imports and things you've done through NPM, through the Node package manager to get useful libraries. It puts all that together in some form and then spits out the JavaScript and HTML and CSS. That's all that I'm doing here, and I'm just going to talk about my method of doing some adjustments after the fact. So in that way, you're going to have to figure out how to apply it to yourself, but whatever your system, in the end, you're going to have some kind of HTML on some server if we're talking about static files. And that's what I'm talking about here. So let's talk about how I'm doing that. So I do that in my case with Next.js, I do the typical build. Actually, we'll just talk about what the typical build is here. Let's just see how I do it. So the first step here, I have this prebuild on my build command. What does prebuild do? Prebuild runs my file system and my search builds. This is actually a tip I have a little bit further down. We'll get into shortly, but it's in regards to kind of just like pre-building files that like often you'll load the system, you load the website, and then let's say to make a list happen, there'll be some logic to say the list looks like this, but that's already known at the time where you build it, typically. Not always if it comes from the server side, but if it's a statically generated site, sometimes you'll have code to make a list of something that you already knew the list for. So in these cases where they're big lists, in the case of my file system for indexing or search for indexing, rather than doing that on the fly and it being slow, I do these little pre-builds. And we'll get into that tip because we'll just get into how you can do more of that down the road. So let's skip that pre-build piece and let's talk about the next piece. So it builds it, and then we have some HTML. let's get into how I take the HTML and optimize it, because that's the next tip. Yeah, here we go. Minifying HTML. So in that case, what I'm using for minifying HTML that I really recommend is this one called HTML Minify Cursor. And it's actually a really interesting one because I actually learned a lot about HTML by using this. I did not realize you could minify HTML to the level that this minifies it. I'll show you what I'm talking about here, but you can see here some of the options it has. My head's kind of in the way of it, unfortunately, a little bit. Yeah, there's nothing I can do about that. The menu's on the side, but there's just a bunch of options. And you can, this is just like a little demo where you can put some HTML in and get a smaller version of it. I run the command line version of it, and in my case, I made a script here that does basically that. I take the cursor minify function, and I've looked through all the little configuration options they had on their website, they have in their docs, and basically just turned as many things on as possible to make it as small as possible. And the HTML that I got out was surprising. So this is the first part. I'll show you the HTML in a moment. Just imagine the HTML you get from Next.js is like, it's slightly minified, but it's not by a tool that's like, let's squeeze HTML to the limit. That's what I feel this tool does, and more than I've ever seen any other tool do. We'll get more into how in a second here. So that's this piece where I shrink it down. But then another piece that I did in the script is I do a little bit of script manipulation where I actually go into the HTML and like, oh, let's change this piece and this piece just by string replacement, really. Here, if you see here, this is just this typical JavaScript replace that you know. The way that I get to the HTML is just a typical reading of the file that you do from Node.js. Where am I doing it here? Yeah, read file sync. That's most people that use Node.js as FS know about the read file and write file. That's all I'm doing with this script. I just run this after the fact. So some of the things I remove are like no script. I don't care about the no script tag. If you come to my site and you don't have JavaScript, I mean, you probably just shouldn't be there, you know. And you know, if it doesn't work, you're not like, what's going on? Where's the message to tell me I need to turn on JavaScript? You know, if you've already been flying around with no script accepting that. What are some other ones here I do? This SVG, it keeps Next.js, I noticed, kept adding path again to the SVGs when it would export it, but you actually don't need this. This can be a self-closing tag from everything I've seen. So I go in and replace that. There's a few little scripts here that I replaced some stuff Next.js added that just weren't necessary. Same with the styled components. It added a few little, what did it add here? It added the version. It seemed totally unnecessary. I removed it. It made no difference. And then also here, Next.js creates this little Next.js data JSON. I changed this a little bit here too. Before, I don't remember what it had. It had some stuff here. I used regex to just say, get whatever's in here, and now we're just going to put this very minimal thing. I tested this, and this was essentially the minimal that you needed in Next.js's case. Your case is going to vary, but basically you take the index.html, whatever it happens to be, and you just look through it and you start chopping it up, and if it breaks, then you don't do that. And that's essentially what I did to get it as small as I could. And I've also taken this, and I also add in build ID. And build ID is coming from the git commit, which I actually read out of the running a git command. This is just a little touch that I add so that when I do my console commands, it shows the build number is actually associated with an actual commit in my GitHub. But that really is neither here nor there from a performance point of view. So let's get into what the HTML looks like, because I wanted to show you that. It goes into the out folder, and it's just a typical HTML file for the most part. But if we go to a HTML beautifier, I want to make it a little more readable because it's pretty much like a one-liner right now. Let's make it a little cleaner. There we go. Let's take this over to VS Code, and we have to tell it it's HTML. It doesn't even know by default. So one thing you're going to notice here, if we look at the HTML, let's just remove that indenting that it seems to be wrong about. Actually, no, that made it way worse. We'll accept whatever kind of auto indenting it's got there. Let's shrink this tag. We'll shrink all the tags so we get it as small as possible. That's the entire HTML right there. And you'll notice, okay, there's the HTML opening tag. Where's the closing tag? Turns out, don't need it. Head, don't need it. Body, don't need it. None of that stuff actually you need, it looks like. Honestly, you don't need this stuff. So that was like a revelation I found, and it seems to be true, and it just makes it a lot smaller, like when you realize you don't need that stuff. So this essentially minifies all that down, so it just has the straight up this first HTML tag, the metas, the title, a link. This meta I could not get rid of. Next.js is mad if you don't get rid of that. And my script tags, essentially what it would be the head. The head would be this piece here. And then this is where you would get into the body. And then this is the one script that executes that essentially is that JSON data. And it looks a lot more simple if you recognize, I mean, HTML, people are used to having head and body and all that stuff. Turns out you don't really need that. So that's another where this is cool. Another thing you don't need that I thought was interesting is a lot of the quotes. So if you see here, a lot of my link tags, there's not even any quotes. When it doesn't have spaces or it doesn't have certain characters, you don't even need quotes. So just as equals image without the like this. Like typically you'd think, oh, you need that. No, you don't need that. And when you do need it, you just add it. So in this case here, where there's a space, and I think also this / it probably doesn't like. I might be wrong on that. Oh yeah, I am wrong on that, because look at here in source, you don't even need quote for URLs. That was another thing where I thought was quite interesting. For some reason, you need that for styled components to work properly. But it inlines all the CSS from my styled components. We'll get into that a little bit and how that's an optimization and also a not optimization in some ways as well. The HTML is very simple. This is all the HTML, like the skeleton HTML before it kind of hydrates it. This is something that Next.js does and a few other React libraries. Angular, I think, does it as well. Some of them do it, some of them don't. But essentially, it makes the HTML and then it loads the JavaScript and kind of brings the HTML to life at that point. That's what's kind of happening here. And that's like another tip that I'm going to get into as well, is that Next.js, when it adds all these script tags, this is essentially the core JavaScript that needs to load to make everything work. And you can actually see what these are. So this one is needed for Webpack. This is the base framework, I believe, for Next.js. This is the main file that has some of the data, I believe, in this app as well. These, I think it's like these bundles here are like the main ones. These ones are mostly libraries, and then these are basically just the boilerplate. But in all cases, they're deferred. So essentially, it loads all of this markup first, and it kind of puts the document up as a skeleton. And then at that point, these are executed before the document's completely loaded. This is needed for Next.js. I can't tell you why. We've discussed the link prefetching, so this happens pretty much right away as well as soon as it sees these. And yeah, those are exactly as I said. Title, you need a title, and it's nice to have one. That's key. And there's a few meta tags here that you want to have. You want to have a meta description. In this case, I really wanted to have this because I need to clarify that I don't want the user to go beyond a certain scale and that the initial scale is 1. This is relevant to having a lot of the sizing work properly. This character set is required. One optimization I think I might be missing is I think you can actually set the character set to on the HTTP headers. And I saw one site said that could be a little tip that it could more quickly know what the character set is. I don't think I'm doing that, but it's pretty minor. This is where we specify the HTML. Language is something it likes to specify as well. That was something I noticed from the validator. That was another piece I wanted to get into. But so yeah, we pretty much discussed the entire markup here. It's very simple. This is the Next.js little wrapper piece. This is my code here if we ignore the wrapper. And I've used semantic HTML elements. So in this case, I have a main element, which is like the desktop. Within the desktop here, we have an ordered list, which is the icons. It starts empty. And that's where the JavaScript loads up. It looks at what's in the desktop and it creates the linked items, the list items, sorry. There's also the nav bar here. This is essentially the taskbar. Within the taskbar, this organized poorly. There's the start button here, which has an SVG. That should look more like that. Like that. That's the start button there. Pretty typical. We have another ordered list here, which is the taskbar entries within the nav, and that's it. So that's I've tried to keep the HTML as simple as possible. This is another thing where it's not, I guess it could be a tip, but I don't have any ad trackers or any of that stuff or any external scripts, but some people like to have those things. I would say for those people, I mean, you just have to accept that you're running someone else's script on your site, and I can't tell you how to adjust performance for that because you're running someone else's code basically. So that's kind of a neither here nor there thing. And then the script we discussed. So I wanted to get into the fact that this is valid HTML. I wanted to just point out that there's this website called validator.w3 where we can also kind of confirm that this is indeed valid HTML. We'll just copy my URL here and paste it in here. Now it's going to have some issues, and the issues are actually just because I use very modern tags. If it wasn't for the fact that I use modern tags, this would say it's completely valid because it detects it otherwise. But one of the few of the issues it has, like I said, fetch priority, that's very modern, and this validator doesn't yet know about that. The image source set with on the links is another thing it doesn't know about. It thinks the link header is missing the href, but image source set essentially supersedes that. And for every browser that supports it, I'm okay with that. Any browser that just supports href, I essentially don't support those browsers because this is common enough at this point, I think. Don't quote me on that necessarily. I mean, when it comes to browser support, there's another thing I can get into with that, where there's this thing called browser list, I believe, where you can specify what kind of browsers you want to support. But it just complains for the 5 links. It has the same 5 complaints. Other than that, it has nothing to say about the HTML. So that it completely considered that HTML valid. In fact, what we can do here is we can go into the network, refresh the page here, and copy my HTML that we got in the response. And then we'll go to the validator again and just directly input the HTML, but without my link headers. Oh, where do they start? This is so minified. Here's the first link header, and they end right. Wow, it's hard to tell. Here. There we go. That's all the link headers. So now if we just check that without the link headers, there we go. We see completely valid HTML. So without any closing tag, without a head, without a body, the W3 validation tool says, you know, that's some good HTML you got there. So that's one little tip I find, that I really made it quite smaller. The HTML, it just got rid of a bunch of stuff, basically. And yeah, I think we've discussed almost everything for HTML minification. I mean, back to static generation for one moment and why we were able to minify this code, because it's not coming from the back end. Essentially what Next.js is doing, and what some other tools are doing, I think Gatsby is doing this as well now, is you create the React code. It's dynamic to a certain extent. Like if we were to look at the code here, let me go to the metadata page where I actually render that. So you'll see here that this is where it's happening, and there's only one link. And it's going through this list here to generate the 5 links. And those 5 links that it generates, that's what the HTML that you get at the end. So Next.js looks at this React, essentially visits the page, gets the generated code that would come from that code running, and then that's what you get to optimize over. So that's what's happening with the static generated code, which, as Next.js themselves say, they recommend. This is on the page just in regards to pages and just about static generation. If you can do it, this is ideal, essentially, in a lot of ways, because then you're not relying on the server and you can do the best optimizations, I would say. But in some cases, you're going to need backend data. You're going to need some kind of initial props that might have changed. And in those cases, some of these rules aren't going to apply, or they're only going to apply to a small subset of what I'm suggesting. So mileage may vary. And then, yeah, it talks about here, if you need some dynamic stuff, then you're not going to be able to do static generation in the same way. But if you do, it's going to give you lots of advantages over with CDNs and et cetera, the stuff we're talking about. That's about that for that. Let's move on to image minification and simplification, basically. So one of the tools that I always like to use, I'm always recommending to people whenever I run into them, is this tool here. This happens to be a Windows tool, but I'll show you the tools that this tool uses, because they can be used on Mac, Linux, that kind of thing. This is just a very cool tool. I don't know how popular it is. It's called File Optimizer. And basically, what's it say here? Is an advanced file optimization featuring lossless file size reduction. And that's what I actually care about. Some people might not. In my case, with these small little thumbnails and icons, the source material that I've got, where I've found, like, let's say 512 by 512 images, I like those images the way they are. I don't want to add some kind of visual compression to them. So I convert typically with lossless. If I have a big source image, I'll make smaller images, but always lossless. If I'm turning them from JPEG or PNG to a different format, I'll make sure it's lossless all the time. And what that tries to do is that you don't lose any visual information, and it doesn't try to run it through some kind of compression algorithms, essentially, other than whatever just the basics are to convert the format, basically. On that note, this Windows tool puts a lot of that together, and you can see here somewhere they'll list all the tools they use. Oh, they have a massive ad right in the middle. That's nice of them. But it says here, following plugins are currently built into the file optimizer. And then they kind of go through them all here. And a lot of these are open source and can be used in many places. Some of these are on my desktop optimization or my desktop environment website. Like FFmpeg and ImageMagick. I actually have cut down versions of those running on my website. But a lot of these, it runs these tools, and in some case, it just does little tricks to the PNGs, not much to the WebPs. The WebPs are already pretty optimized. But the PNGs, it's able to squeeze a little more out of with things like there's this Pingo, PNG Optimizer, PNG Out, PNG Quant, PNG Rewrite, PNG Wolf, Zoply. Basically, it just runs it through a bunch of these to try to squeeze every little bite out of it. And you lose no visual information. And sometimes it makes a huge difference, I've found. With SVGs, with JPEGs, with PNGs especially, it can be pretty insane where there's visually literally zero difference in the image, but it can be half the size in some cases. So after you run it through this tool, you think, why was I ever serving the users like an extra hundreds of kilobytes of nothing, basically? Sometimes it's metadata, or it's things inside the image that are essentially unseeable, or just you're not showing those things, you know? And that's going to get into another piece. So this is on the image optimization piece. On this note, I typically will take PNG images, and we'll get into this in another tip where I'm using more modern formats, is I'll convert it to more modern formats, and then I'll run all of those images through these tools where it just tries to just squeeze every little last lossless bite that it can out of the images. On that note of more simple images, that's where I wanted to get into just a quick little mention of favicons, these icons. So like the icon here, this little M, my little brain icon. My thought on it, I mean, I'm not, at least at this point, expecting people to take my app and try to make it a bookmark on their phone. If they do, I can't say it's going to look so great. It's going to be 48 pixel by 48 pixel blown up to whatever their phone decides to blow it up to. And that's best case scenario. I accept that right now, but some people might not. And in that case, there are a lot of headers that you can add into the HTML to make sure that they get the right icon in the right situation. And it gets into it here on this Mozilla, this MDN page where they kind of talk about it. So this is the basic one. In this case, I would absolutely not recommend doing this, where you put a link header to the favicon that happens to be at the root level, because pretty much every browser is going to look for it there by default anyways. So you can just completely omit this kind of entry. And in my case, that's all I use, because every browser that I've seen, every scenario seems to at least try to work with this icon if this is all it has. And for me, that's okay right now. But like I say, for other people it might not be, and you can see here there's many different varieties of how you can do these using these link tags. But in this case, the rel, instead of preload, it can be other things. Let's say the Apple Touch icon precomposed, and that's like an actual name that you'd have to put in. And then you have to specify a size and a ref. So this really bulks up your HTML. And to me, you don't get very much for it. I've had really good mileage with just taking a favicon, an icon file, opening it up in some kind of free icon editor. You have to find your own. The one I found is not great, but I was able to kind of trim it down because the .ico files can have multiple images. What I did is I took out the 16 by 6 one, the 32 by 32, all the smaller ones, and I just kept the 48 by 48. And for me, that worked. I've been using that everywhere. Just that. No HTML. Just the fact that the browser will request this on the root directory, and I have an icon that has that 48 by 48. Most of the time it's using that or making it smaller. In some rare scenarios, it wants to try to make that bigger, and it's going to stretch it, and I don't know how it's going to look. And that's where you might want to consider, if you're someone that cares about that, you might want to consider these bigger sizes. And it doesn't add very much, so down the road I might consider that, but I'm thinking to do that when I go the route of doing these progressive web apps where you make these manifest files and then you clarify all the icons you want and you essentially treat your website like an app. In those cases, sure, I'm accepting someone's going to take my website icon and put it on their home screen or something if they want to. And in that case, I want to have a nice icon. But I'm not at that level yet, or at that point where I want to do that. that's the basics of the favicon. Actually, let me just quickly, there's one more article about favicon here where it kind of just gets into what I was saying, because this site has some charts on Wikipedia. Yeah, it kind of just gets into all the different scenarios and what favicons there are now. There's ICO, PNG, GIF. Some of them support SVG, but you get very mixed results, and ICO pretty much always works from what I've found. I think someone will probably message me at some point or tell me some scenario where it's not ideal. Like I say, to me, the non-ideal is the fact that when the device in question is going to want something bigger than the 48 by 48 that I've provided. Other than that, I'm happy to get rid of all those silly link headers and making 10 different formats and sizes. But it's not particularly hard to do anyways. There's some good websites for generating it if you go down that road, but I'm just doing this one image. Let's get into the modern images now. So this is where I was talking about. So that in that case, it was talking about the .ico files, which I think I learned recently are basically PNG files with a little bit of magic in the headers to make them icon files. But most browsers, let's do Can I Use first, because I was talking about that Can I Use website. I wanted to show you. So this is that website, caniuse.com, and you can put in different features you've heard about. Oh, I've heard about, HTTP 3 I was mentioning, and it'll talk about the protocol. So you see here it's supported. It looks like, what is it, Safari not supporting it? Can be enabled. It's possible Safari doesn't completely support it, but in that case, Cloudflare will go down to the lower protocols. You can see in Chromium and Firefox it's been supported for a while. That's off topic though. So in the WebP case here, you can see it's pretty much supported by all browsers. There's no real relevant caveats as far as I see. Safari here basically supports it as well. So I'm pretty happy to use WebP. The other format is called AVIF. That's another modern one. That's not supported on Safari or Edge at the moment for some reason. I don't know why Edge doesn't support it, because Edge and Chrome are in some ways very similar, but it looks like Edge has disabled it. Maybe they don't think it's ready for prime time. I'm not sure. On that note, I have another website here, and there's a reason why I don't use AVIF. So I tried to use AVIF. I honestly, I tried. And if we go here to compression, they talk about it. I think I had a specific piece of the article where they discuss lossless. For lossless compression, AVIF and WebP perform similarly with both non-photographic images like graphic design and photographs. So what I found in my testing was that images like these ones, these small little icons that are not photographs, it's like it's a picture. I don't know what no, it is a photo. There's some difference, not from a camera, the one that some artist made. I found that AVIF did not offer as good lossless compression as WebP. So I think that's where you're going to have to look for these. It's not just AVIF is better in every scenario. And I found a blog post that if you just believe the title, it almost felt like it said that. But when I actually dived into it, and I actually went as far as just trusting that article at one point. I made all the AVIFs. I did a bunch of work to make it so that was going to be the default. And then when I actually looked at it, I was like, wait a minute, this is bigger. And I tried messing with different lossies and lossless tweaks to the AVIF, and I just couldn't get it to look quite right. So in the end, I'm with WebP right now. On the note of WebP, so this AVIF IO site, first of all, is pretty good. If you do go the route of AVIF, I think actually it is better for, let's say, big photos and stuff. I think it does have its uses where if you happen to want to support that, if you have a like this is where too the CDN, some of the content delivery networks also have an image pipeline, or they have a way where you can just give them a PNG, but then on your website you can use one of their special URLs, let's say, to serve the most modern image, or it can even be done in an even more seamless way. But you can some of the CDNs can make you have the more modern images. I like to control it myself, and on that note, I use this tool. This is from Google called CWebP. This essentially compresses the WebPs. So I have the PNGs already. Sometimes I create them with ImageMagick. Sometimes I already have them because I've just found them from source material. And I use this tool to make them into WebPs, and I do all the different little lossless settings and just every little tweak I can do to try to make it work as small as possible before I run it through that file optimizer tool. So that's about it for the WebP AVIF. Let's go on to the 13th tip. Oh, let's take a sip of my drink for a second first. It's actually really good, this Ultra Fiesta Mango. I gotta give it to them. So lazy loading. This is an interesting one because it means a lot of things. I think first we're going to talk about the lazy loading
yeah, let's just get into lazy loading. There's a bunch of different ways to talk about it at the image level, at the module script level, and at the the JavaScript level as well, separate from the image HTML level. So some of the lazy loading they talk about here involves, let's say, this dynamic import. This is one way that I'm doing it. And the example for that, if people are, oh, I didn't switch to the browser. Let me switch to the browser. So this was the article here on the MDN for lazy loading. This gets into a lot and talks about a lot of it. One of the first pieces it talks about that I'm using is this dynamic importing. And I'm actually using this in two separate ways. So if you're used to code and your typical web page here, so you see at the top of a JavaScript file, you're used to having these imports. So these things that you import up here, Webpack is going to see these and say, okay, I need these to be part of the main bundle. These are the first thing that's going to load. If you don't want that to happen, that's where we get into these dynamic loading elements. And I have some examples of it. Let me just search for one because I got a bunch of them somewhere. So let's say here, I have the loading element, the loading styled component. Now, if the page isn't loading, this doesn't need to exist necessarily right away. So Next.js has a system in place where you can wrap this dynamic function around it to say that this component, this React component itself, can be lazy loaded. So until that React component shows and is tried to be rendered, don't even include that JavaScript on the initial load. I'll give you that JavaScript to load this component when the time comes, essentially. And it's using the dynamic Next.js piece. This is Next.js specific, but React has another way of doing it, like called lazy, I think. But this, if you're using Next.js, you should use it this way. And it also uses the import, the dynamic import. So this syntax is actually just part of JavaScript, basically. This is the same kind of import as here, but it allows you to do an import during loading, basically. Or sorry, during runtime, at the point in which the user is already on your website. Versus these ones here, which are just going to be all put into one big JavaScript file. And it's good to know that distinction because sometimes you want that. You don't always want it to be dynamic, you know? Like, let's say in my case, the desktop. I don't need the desktop to be dynamic because I know it's going to be loaded. It would be bad if it did not load. So let's not worry about it being dynamic. Let's just give them that right away. And that's the case in a lot of on-load things. What else did I have for lazy loading here? So I discussed the dynamic import. Yeah, let's get back to that lazy loading article because there's several other pieces to lazy loading. So another piece to lazy loading here is, there's actually several pieces to it, honestly. Here's what I'm looking for in the image tag. So the image tag has another thing called loading that you can add to it. Here's an HTML image tag. And in here in loading, you can actually specify lazy or eager. We can click loading here to explain it. Yeah, eager or lazy. And these can make a difference as to how it loads quite a bit. These actually add a lot of logic to the image itself. When you say loading lazy, essentially that image will just not be requested until you've scrolled it into view. So you essentially allow the browser to say, hey, you know, once that image is visible, then load it, which is quite nice. And most of the time, that is a useful feature when you want to do it that way. In some cases, if you want to do it in JavaScript and you don't want to, or let's say the image itself is dynamic, you want, when they get to a certain point, tell me, and then I'll do something about it. You know, I'll load the image I want. In that case, you can use these things called intersection observers. And I've used a couple of these, I think, if you look in my code here. Yeah, this is for the main icon here. So I have some dynamic icons where first it's going to load the generic file. And then if the user views it, then it's going to do the heavier task where it says, okay, the user's seen it. Let's load something more extreme. Let's load a more advanced icon. And I'm actually doing it in a pretty advanced way here if we get into it. But I create an intersection observer where I say, like, the button where the icon is, look at that. And whenever that, like, let's say this is the viewport, this is the user's window. When it gets like this, when it gets to the point where the user can see it even the littlest bit, that's considered intersection of the viewport, basically. Or whatever you happen to be. You can specify a root. In this case, because it's involving my file manager where the icons are those list items, I've actually specified the root as the container for it. So when if they're scrolling within that container, you'll know when it gets into the viewport within that container, separate from the entire viewport of the window of the browser. And then what I do here is if it's simple enough how to do these intersection observers, where, like I say, you put the container element, you put the element that you want it to go into view. You can specify a little bit of a margin. In this case, I've set 5 pixels. So even if it gets 5 pixels to the viewport, That's enough to trigger. And then there's a little bit of logic you have to add for triggering. It's pretty simple though. You just have this intersection ratio, and when it's greater than 0, essentially it intersects. So that's just the logic. That's it. And then at that point, you can disconnect the observer. So you can say, okay, I'm done with you. You don't need to observe anymore. I got what I need to know. And then in this case, I've been doing some more advanced stuff. I've actually learned how to create these abort controllers, because this get icon is an asynchronous request, and it's a little slow. So basically, if they've opened a window and then all of a sudden they put into view a bunch of icons that are going to be heavy work, and then all of a sudden they close that folder, I want to tell those asynchronous operations, hey, stop, don't worry about it. And that's something that this abort controller can do. So that's like a performance optimization, but only for the scenarios where the user essentially backs out of something. It can happen on load, so it's something good to think about, that if you have asynchronous operations where you're like, it's unfortunate that has to run because 20% of the time I want it to stop, that's where you can look into these abort controllers, because they're actually pretty cool. But that's like partially not a performance optimization tip. I'm not sure. Maybe it is. Okay, so yeah, that's the basics of the lazy loading. You can use it on images. You can use it with these intersection observers. And by doing that, essentially, that can save you a lot. Let's explain quickly as to why. Let's say for some reason the user had a really tiny window and their viewport essentially ended like right here, and they couldn't even see, let's say, this icon. Because of lazy loading, whenever they can see that icon, that's when it would load. So if they come to the page and there's things that are not visible to them, it's not going to take time of the load to request those things. And it's especially useful for me from a performance point of view. If you open one of these folders here, and let's say you have icons that go all the way down inside this little box here, I don't want it to load anything below that list, basically, because I can't see it. Those are less on load, but in general, it's pretty important. Most sites, my site happens to be a little contained box, but most sites have a place to. Oop! I bumped my microphone. Most sites have a down. They have more to their site where you scroll down. So that's where lazy loading really comes into place. You don't need to load any of that stuff, and this also helps you. It's like financially useful. Actually, a lot of these performance optimizations are, because you're serving the user less data, and by making them do less requests, you're also having less bandwidth. And in both those scenarios, you're going to save money on hosting costs, if those matter to you. I happen to have like one of those unlimited accounts that's really slow. That's where it's nice to have that in between. So StableHost is like unlimited, but very slow. But then I use Cloudflare to kind of cache it as soon as possible, basically. So that people rarely use StableHost other than me when I'm just like warming up the files. Where are we now? Okay, that was number 13. So number 14 is just testing. I mean, you could do this at any point, but let's get into testing. So there's a couple ways to do it. There's a tool called Lighthouse that's built into Chromium browsers. So like Edge and Chrome is one of the browsers. And Lighthouse is pretty interesting. It's actually open source too. This is like the GitHub repository for Lighthouse. I'll get into shortly in a minute here why I actually go to this repository sometimes. But we'll go back to the website here, and if you look in DevTools, it's actually just an option here where you can do Lighthouse. And I score more favorably on the desktop. So we're going to do desktop. We're going to pick everything except for a progressive web app, because I'm not doing a progressive web app yet. That's where we get into that manifest file, and I'd like to do that at one point, because then we can have offline support. But that's for another day, and that has its own performance optimizations. Anyways, I pressed Analyze. We're going to load the page here and just see what it's like. While it's loading here, I got a few messages here. Let's just see this recent one here from Brian Watson. Dustin, for lazy loading, is there a setting that is essentially, if the browser isn't currently loading anything, then load these images so they are ready before being visible? Yes, absolutely. That gets into, that's a good question. If the browser isn't currently loading anything, like, that's tricky. So the concept of the browser isn't currently loading anything, there actually is already a way to do that. It's called this request idle callback. And you can use request idle callback. This method queues a function to be called during a browser's idle period. This happens faster than you'd think. Basically, the second onload has happened, it's boom, it goes to that. So if that's the kind of thing you're looking for, then you can create a function that will, once that request idle callback has occurred, you can preload the images by putting those link preload headers in the document head. And then once those link headers are there, then it's essentially preloaded. So at whatever point those images occur, it will work. But typically you're going to want to do that right at the moment that it's going to happen, which is what I was doing for the hovering event. Other than that, it's not really considered lazy loading almost. The whole lazy loading is almost like a deferral concept. But thanks for the question. I have a few more comments here from Profil. He said, what do you say here? Any good options on Bun? Yeah, I don't know much about Bun yet. I've seen it's interesting. It's just this gets into like it's another runtime environment, kind of like Node, I believe, in that way. But at the same time, because I'm doing static site generation, I don't actually use Node on my server side or Bun or anything like that, the V8 engine, anything like that. So it would only improve my build times, really, because after that, then I just have HTML, and that's all that my web server, my backend is serving right now. Yeah, what other message did he put here? Next.js dynamic will work across major browsers. Yes, it works across major browsers as well. It's just the Next.js dynamic, or like the React lazy, it's all kind of working with Webpack, with the idea of this dynamic modules. Actually, that's another good question here. We can actually look at that. If I go, can I use, and we look at the dynamic import here, and you can see the browser support. So again, this is the little cone that I care about here, actually, is these little, how many boxes? These 10 boxes here. These are the ones I look at. So these are like the past browsers. So the past Chrome, past Edge, Safari. These are the most modern ones right here, the 103s. If I can get in that little box of support, I'm usually happy. So in that case, we already have all this dynamic import. So what that means is that any of these browsers, if they went to my site, they would be able to, on a certain triggering of event that Webpack has already kind of put into place with the way it packaged everything, that when something's needed, it knows to make a request before it can move forward, basically, because that's how this dynamic importing works. It's like, hey, give me the module. Another message here from Brian. Awesome, thanks, good answer. Building a Next.js project right now, and I'll try implementing all these tips. Cool. Well, I've got more of them. Let's get more into these tips here. Where was I here? So I was still talking about Lighthouse. If we go to my Lighthouse, I got a pretty good score. I got a score good enough to get the fireworks. So again, this is on desktop, and I want to get into OneNote for that. So if we look at this, I did pretty good. Some of the things too, and we'll get into some of these tips that are also very useful. One of them is cumulative layout shift. A big reason why this is the way it is because of the way that I've set the dimensions of all my images. Even before they load, I happen to know the size that they're going to be. And just the way that I've set up the JavaScript and the React code is that there's no images where I don't define the sizes basically ahead of time. And that's really helpful with this layout shift, basically, is that when it's first making all the elements, before it's had time to do some of the network requests to make them pretty and stuff, it already has kind of distributed the space that is needed. So it's not going to start small, and then when the image loads, it's like, oh, actually the image is this big, and then it shifts a bunch of stuff. I think that also attributes to total blocking time, although that's another separate thing. I can't take credit for all of these either. Like Next.js and just some of the other tooling that I've done does a lot of good optimization, and it's just the way that I structured my site. So again, mileage is going to vary, but sometimes when you get, like, if you were to get total blocking time or you get cumulative layout shift, what you could do with these Lighthouse tests is you click here. And wait, no, you don't click there. You go here, view the original trace, and it'll open it in the performance thing, the performance tab, and you can see all the process as it goes through it. And you'd be able to see if you had some of this layout shift, you could attribute it to some of the metrics here. In this case, I didn't have any, so it's not going to show those in any meaningful way that I can show properly. You can see some of them here in the timings, and it's a little hard to navigate this, just because it's so small, but it's so small because of the way I'm trying to display everything. I could do an entire episode about this, and I don't know a lot of things about this. I don't get a lot from these performance metrics a lot of times. I've seen videos where people go in, and I think you have to go in with a purpose, honestly. You have to go in and go, I have some suspicions, or you have to see something and it's like, okay. If you've already optimized a site, you're going to look at this and you're probably going to find false positives. You're going to find things that are big, and it's like you're trying to squeeze a rock kind of thing. You've already got enough out of it. And that's where I feel I am at this point. And there were points where I wasn't at that. So that's why it's a little harder in this chart to show you, here's where I could fix this and this, because I've already gone through and done those things. But yeah, like I said, that's another episode if I wanted to get into that. Moving back to the Lighthouse performance stuff, you can get some little tips here too if some of these numbers are bad. If you scroll down, it would give you different suggestions. A lot of these are pretty easy. Like the performance one is really what we're discussing today. The accessibility, the best practices in the SEO, that's as simple as just doing what it says, essentially. Those are checklist items. But the performance, that's something where you actually have to get certain numbers. So that can be a little bit harder to achieve. And that's why we're talking more about that. So that's what with Lighthouse where it can be useful. Like if you see these numbers kind of not ideal, or if you want to get into the trace and actually look for things where it's like, why is there this big block of purple or whatever it happens to be? Zoom into that and try to make sense of it. You know, if right away you're like, oh, okay, that's the framework, it probably is doing something, fine. But if you're like, oh, that's my button, like why does my button take a second to load? That doesn't make any sense. So hopefully you find things like that. I find like that's where what I can get from this trace. I'm not going to be able to go and look at every one of these little colored blocks. I mean, I guess I could. I've seen people do that actually, where they print out a massive paper and then they'll just circle every little thing. And hey, why not if you have time? But I'm not going to do that with my life, I think. Probably. Not into it. What other tests did I have? There's some other good tests. There's another site here called GTMetrix. They used to be a little bit better. Oh, yes. Also on the note of Lighthouse, if you happen to be using a browser that does not have Lighthouse built in, there's also this pagespeed.web.dev site that will also just run Lighthouse, basically. Oh, and another note, too, what I was saying about desktop is favorable. So if we switch to mobile, it does a different kind of test. It resizes it differently. And what I've learned is that it actually runs some artificial network latency after the fact, and that is really hard to beat. So if you see here, on mobile I've got 90% performance. How do you get 100? It's really tough. That's where I wanted to get back into this GitHub, what I was talking about. Quickly, let's just see. If you look at the performance, what it's complaining about is this largest contentful paint. And again, this is where it's really useful though. So if you look at it, where is it here? It's does it show it in here? I think it does. Let me try to find it. Here it is, LCP, and it'll actually tell you. So it says this image is the one that took the longest or was the largest. I can't recall what it is, but this is the one that it wants me to optimize. But basically, if I optimize, if I optimize that, it would just be another one. It's always going to be something. The problem is that it took 3 whatever seconds. But what I found out after a lot of work is that it didn't really take that long. And that the problem is this artificial adjustments that it does. So if you actually look here in the source code for Lighthouse, they have all their configs here, and you can see their mobile config, and it actually talks about some of the stuff it does, like the first content painful 3G here metric, and the way that it adjusts some of the performance metrics after the fact. Max, I'm not going to be able to just find it randomly, but I dug through it a bit, and basically that is what's happening in the end, is that after the fact, so it loaded in whatever speed it loaded, and then artificially it adjusts it. Another way you can actually test that, or you can see that it acts differently, and this is where too that it became really confusing when you look at the source traces, is that it's actually adding some like fake latency in here when you do tests that add latency. Because when you do these performance metrics, you can actually change your network performance. So if you go into network here, you can add throttling. Oh, it's not showing the drop down here. Well, there's a drop down here called throttling. I can click like slow 3G, or I can say no throttling, and it'll do some kind of artificial modification of the network speed to try to give you some kind of fake performance net metrics. And essentially that's what's happening here. So this is something I've kind of just decided to live with for now. The fact that it says this, because to get it to the number that it wants would be a bit of work for something that's essentially artificial. And that's something to take where you got to take these tests with a grain of salt a little bit, because sometimes they suggest stuff where it's actually not worth it, or you just get to the point where it's like, I got to suggest, it has to suggest something, you know, like at some point there won't be anything on the list, but until then there's going to be some stuff where it's like, this is not worth my time. So another test site is GTMetrix. I cannot get 100% on this site. I think I'm hoping, like they test with Chrome 98. I'm hoping when they start testing with Chrome 103 or whatever, that some of my more modern features will allow me to get 100, because they typically let me get 99. Maybe they won't today. Yeah, I got 99. Nice. So pretty good rating I got. And it doesn't really have anything to suggest for me to change. So from my point of view, it's really hard to improve on to get that extra 1%. But you can see here that they used Chrome version 98. And a lot of the tips that I've suggested are in like Chrome 101, Chrome 103 for some of my preloads. I mean, the early hints, I'm not even doing that yet. But once we add early hints in there, who's to say? So that's some of the other testing you can do. And then I have one other test page, which is WebpageTest. I used to like these guys a little more, but they're still pretty good. I typically pick desktop, I guess. I pick in Canada. I'm from Canada. You're going to get better repeat views. This is another thing, again, with the warm-ups, too. The CDN hit versus miss is that the hits are only for me anyways. So it's actually only really warming it up for the Vancouver people anyways, as far as I know. Maybe this is where if you paid for Cloudflare, you could have better warming up periods or something. I'm not sure. Or perhaps there's a solution to that I'm not aware of. But in the case of like this test, if this test is in Toronto, it might get a miss from the cache and have a slow request. So I've often found with these tests, you're better to do multiple to make sure that it got cached, you know. In this case, it may have already been cached. So let's see here. The LCP was 1.78. If we rerun the test, let's see if we get like way better, then it probably was a miss. And something too with these tests, often with good websites like this WebpageTest, they will show that you can get the headers and see every little request and see like, well, was it a miss? Was it a hit? Another message here from Brian. Yeah, it becomes more of an issue of yes, 3G connections are slow versus yes, the site is optimized. Yeah. And not only that, but it's artificial lag. So it's some kind of always not best case scenario that they're testing for almost from what I've seen from the lag. Because on my phone, I don't typically get 3 seconds of lag in most scenarios. I mean, I'm often on 4G, I'll admit. But sometimes I switch to where it doesn't say 4G anymore, which I'm guessing is 3G. And it's still okay. It's not 3 seconds. I guess it depends on the site. So the LCP didn't improve too much. At least these are still 0 and 0, which is nice. It'll show you a little graph here of how it loaded to the point where it got the visuals. Actually, it looks like at 1.7 here it had the icons, but the wallpaper takes a little longer to load. We'll get into some of the optimizations I'm doing for the wallpaper too, as we're on the front end now. So these can be pretty useful too, these little waterfalls. You get a lot of this from Lighthouse or just like looking at the network graphs when you refresh the page. But this website, WebpageTest, has some pretty nice waterfalls where you can kind of look at the code, and it has a lot of information where it'll tell you the points in which it loaded things, as you can see here, those preload images. Yeah, just various things. Sometimes things will stand out if they have performance issues. Okay. Let's go on to the next thing. So the next thing on my list, number 15, we got 10 more to go. How long are we in? I don't even know how long we've been doing this. Let me see. Oh wow, an hour and a half. We're already into it. Wow, okay. All right, this is going to be a long video then. Much longer than I imagined. Because we're only on 15. Web workers and off-screen canvas. Yes, so if we go to my page here, 2 other things that I'm utilizing are web workers and off-screen canvas. And what does that mean? So when we refresh the page and we load it, you'll see what you can see here if you go to the sources tab under oops, I'm not on my browser here. So I'm loading my page, refresh it again. On the sources tab under threads, there's actually three threads. And one of them is the main thread. That one everybody has. And we'll look at the main thread here. This, MDN talks about this. The main thread is where a browser processes user events and paints. Yes, so the painting, we can't move that too much, but that's where the off-screen canvas comes in. We can do some of the painting, essentially the drawing of the picture that the user will see. We can do some of that in other threads, on other processor threads. So asynchronous at the same time, basically. In parallel, I guess, in that case. And that's what these threads do. So when the page first loads, the JavaScript kicks in. I have it load 2 worker threads that I've created. And you can see their source code here. One is for the clock and one is for the wallpaper. And they themselves will also load JavaScript, additional requests. But they do those requests in a separate thread. And they also have their fetch priority set to highest as well. So they're pretty basic, the code. I won't get into the code of it. But what it does is it loads, by having these be separate threads instead of instead of waiting for the wallpaper and the clock to load on the main thread can start drawing the icons. It won't have any hesitation or skipping because it's able to do those things in a non-blocking manner separately. So non-blocking, without blocking the main thread and the visuals, it can go and get the 3JS wallpaper JavaScript file, the Vantage.js waves file for wallpaper, and then load up the wallpaper, paint it in an off-screen canvas, and start showing it on the canvas. Same with the clock. I actually have the clock also on an off-screen canvas. And what are the off-screen canvases? If you're utilizing these web workers, there's some limitations to what you can do inside these web workers. Basically, you don't have access to the document object, the DOM. So from within clock, I can't go tell it to change some piece of the HTML. Like I can't go document.get element by ID clock or get all the divs. You can't do that from a worker. But what you can do when you initialize the worker or in a post message when you're talking to the worker is you can pass it certain objects. There's certain things you can pass it like an off-screen canvas. So you can say on the main thread, you can say, I've made a canvas. I've made a place where you can draw stuff. Here's a reference to that. So you in your thread, you can draw to it now. That's the power of these off-screen canvases. And I think in the future, I'm going to use these more because essentially these can allow me to do some like powerful multi-threading. For example, these windows. Right now, these are full-on windows and that are part of the main thread, sorry. But at one point, perhaps this could be an entire off-screen canvas. And once I put everything off-screen and I have more threads, I mean, perhaps the sky's the limit. We'll see. We'll see how far browsers allow me to go. But that's a far future idea. And it talks about it here. Off-screen canvas interface provides a canvas that can be rendered off-screen. It's available in both window and worker contexts. Yes. But it's only relevant off-screen in a worker context as far as I can think. So that's another handy one I use. And yeah, that's what I would suggest. So in any scenario where you think you can do some kind of processing off-screen, move it off-screen. And there's actually, I should probably recommend this Party Town, I think it's called. Is it called Party Town? Yeah, Party Town. I've heard about this. I haven't tried it. I'm not sure if it's good, but I'm recommending it. Probably a bad idea. Run third-party scripts from a web worker. So for people that have external scripts like a Google Analytics, or that might be a bad example. I'm not sure what their best use cases are, but many external scripts can be loaded in web workers so that they essentially don't block the main thread and they can do their thing in the background. And this Party Town library makes that a little easier, I believe, as you can see from this animation drawing right here. Whatever that means, I don't know. Yeah, without Party Town, with Party Town. So, and forgetting Party Town, this is how I'm doing it with my own code, essentially, is through these workers. I've figured out my own way to delegate the wallpaper and the clock. And I haven't found much else to delegate in this case. The file system itself, I could, but it causes other issues with how the requests occur asynchronously. And it just gave me a bunch of other headaches, so I haven't done that yet. But that's plan. That's coming one day. Next thing on the list, targeting modern browsers. Yeah, so this gets into the same thing I was talking about just sticking to the last couple versions of browsers and not supporting this ECMAScript 5, the ES5. Essentially, ES5 is the JavaScript language that existed many years ago before they started adding more and more features. And at the point where they added this ES6, which was quite a long time ago, it was in 2015, so it was like 7 years ago, I guess. And as you can see, it's part of that little 2-square bubble that I like, where it's supported by current browsers and past browsers of the browsers that I care to support. Internet Explorer, I don't care about, by the way. Nobody does anymore. Actually, some people do. I shouldn't say that. It's still cared about by some. But ES6 is essentially my minimum bar. That's where I care. And on that note, I've codified that in some of my code. So if you look at my package.json file, and this is something Next.js supports. Oh, I didn't want to close that. Let me open that back up again. Yeah, okay, good. That's still there. If we go to my package.json file, I've added this entry called browsers. My picture's in the way. Let me just make some space for it real quick. So it's this thing called browsers list, and it's a special string you can specify to your compilers, like your Webpack or let's say if I was using different kinds of CSS, I'm using styled components, which don't benefit so much from this build step. But by specifying which browsers you support, the building of the files themselves become less changed. So if you support modern browsers, there's less chance that the code is going to need to essentially downgrade or add extra code to support the code that you tried to add. And typically that extra code is something called polyfills. It's a way of adding code so that older browsers can work with the way that you've done some kind of syntax. Typically it doesn't work with syntaxes where it's like special words in JavaScript, but it can work with additional functions like array dot for each or array dot whatever. Things where they're like prototype functions where you can add to the prototype of an array so that the array has more abilities. But you can't add syntax. You can't add the async await syntax in a polyfill, as far as I know. Pretty sure you can't. Anyways, this string syntax here for browser list is a way to specify that. So what I have here is I have the defaults that I like, the defaults from browsers list. They're okay as a starting point. And I only want to support ES6. And I don't want to support IE11, which supports ES6, but I hate IE now. Oh, I need another sip of my Monster. It's almost done. And greater than 1%. So what the 1% means is they have a statistic that they follow, which is based on real data, that says like the 1% of most used browsers, basically, or 1% of used browsers based on usage statistics. So that covers most browsers, and that's essentially what I care about. That top 1% is like 95% of all web browsers, basically. Don't quote me on any of that. It's all made up, all that numbers. Let's just go to browser list here just to quickly look at their syntax. They have like their own open source project. For some reason, their page is to Twitter. I don't know why. But they talk about their syntax a little bit. They have some other things that are a little more clear than that, greater than 1%. Some of the syntax I like for that is, let's say here they have some, and they explain here how you can kind of word it. Let's say the last two versions. So the last two versions of every browser that you support, let's say. That's another way that it can be worded. So browser list has its uses. But like I say, it's not going to completely help, but it doesn't hurt to add that because at build level, it can make the package smaller and make it not require supporting older browsers. So my real tip there is just stop supporting older browsers, because to support older browsers, you add code typically. Oh, that's another thing on the TS config side too. You can actually specify as your target a certain version of JavaScript as well. But you have to be careful with this, because if you use too modern of a syntax, you might get browsers that don't support things that are important. And there's no easy way except other than that, like, can I use site for knowing some of these syntaxes. So let's say the async await. This is supported by all of them. But if you were to use the word async in a browser that it doesn't work on, it would probably break everything, because it's just like syntactically incorrect JavaScript to it. So it's like, you've written bad JavaScript. I'm done. That's where you got to watch out. That's where you have to know when you're writing the JavaScript, is this at least ES6, and is this like not too in the future, such as like some of the features are like ES 2021, but they've been talked about enough where you think, oh, this is probably supported, and then all of a sudden someone comes along and the latest version of Safari, and your page doesn't look correct at all because you're expecting some little string feature to work that actually Safari doesn't have that yet. So that's where you got to watch out. On that note, though, the browsers are actually working on a few initiatives to try to have more support throughout the Safari, the Firefoxes, the Chromes. There's a few initiatives that they're working on right now. There was one called Compat 2021. I think they have like Interop 2022 now. It's just like their code names for all the different, they have like checklists of things that they're trying to support to try to get feature parity. Anyways, that's the big part of most of those as far as the modern browsers. So let's move on to the next piece here, is the advanced library settings. This is pretty generic, but I'll tell you I'll tell you two places here where it's generic, because it's going to depend on how you use things. So in my case, let's say I'll show you two examples. So I use Framer Motion, and I found out with Framer Motion recently that the bundle size could be reduced. So at the start, when you first load my page, I don't have any animations at the moment. The animations that I'm using are like when a window opens, when the taskbar opens, when stuff opens. But typically when you first load the page, nothing's going to load as far as like one of my fake windows or whatever. So that animation can essentially be lazy loaded, but I don't have control over Framer's library. So in the case, so as me as someone who's using an animation library, I had to go in and go, I wonder if the animation library that I use has some way to reduce or lazy load. And that's where I kind of looked and found this, that there was a system of lazy load with framer motion where instead of the motion function that people are used to, there's one just called M, and it's actually a slimmer, it's like slimmer. And you can also do lazy motion here, and you can, there's one other one that I think I do where you can kind of like load things after the fact. Where is that? Maybe that was this features. Oh, that was the lazy motion, I think. So that's just one example where with framer motion, I mean, I can't tell you everyone should do this because not everyone's using framer motion. But that's just one example, and there's so many of these. So I'd say for every library you're using, you should look for these kind of extra features. Here's another one. So I use styled components, and I found one here, dead code elimination. I mean, I don't know if this does anything. I didn't actually look to compare, but this isn't on by default, you know? So why not put it on? Because for the most part, it sounds good. I couldn't find really a downside that made much sense to me as to why it's off. maybe there's some bad scenarios to it. But these are the kind of things where you got to play around with it, and you're like, oh man, I turned that on. I just made it 10 kilobytes smaller, or I made it faster, and it can have some kind of substantive change. Another big one is Next.js, and this is going to be whatever your framework is, like Angular or whatever. There's a million frameworks out there, but whatever your framework is, it's going to have some settings file. In the case of me with Next.js, I've got the Next.js settings file, and mine's rather large because I've actually put a lot of stuff in there because I read it. So you see, I pretty much tried to do all the different settings to try to get the most out of it. I don't think I've done them all. They add new ones all the time. This is where you can actually go to GitHub and you could just look at the way, like the code that they use to interpret their config file to see what the config settings are if you want. Because there's no, like the help file is not going to mention some of the secret settings that you can use. I don't know if I'm using any of them, but for example, React remove properties, remove console logs. And then with the styled components, that pure setting that I found, this is part of Next.js. What other ones are there of use here? These experimental ones, the browser list feature that I was mentioning. So when I'm using the SWC minifier that they provide, which I use for production. So I have this code here that says not for production. So I check here, and when I'm running in development mode, I don't minify with SWC, but when I run it, when I make a production build, I minify with SWC, and then I also allow it to interpret the browser list so that it makes sure to know that I don't care about any of the ES5 stuff. I say I don't support legacy browsers. There's so many settings. Optimize fonts, I say false because I don't even use the fonts in that way. I'll get into that in a tip that coming up today, right now, not next probably. And then also you can set up Webpack settings as well. Webpack is a whole other mess of bananas where you could set up a million things within this config you could change. This has no performance relevance. This is just for some script that actually needed some kind of module replacement. But you could put a lot of stuff in here. You could do a bunch of other Webpack optimizations to be very specific if you want. And then I also have this ability to run this bundle analyzer depending on how I run my build command. We'll get into that. That's another tip where I'll talk about the bundle analyzer. That's not a Next.js specific thing. Quickly going into the settings for Next.js. Oh, I keep bumping my mic. Sorry, folks. But so yeah, like what I said, whatever your framework is, they're going to have advanced settings, and just go through this. I mean, here they talk about a lot of them here, but I actually enjoy going through these when I'm making an app and it's mine and I'm just like trying to fine tune it. It's like, well, let's just read this. Like, what are all the options? And like, there's a million options here, you know, like use React 18 and do this and do that. Like these are going to be very specific. Most of these we're talking about, such as the static generation and that kind of thing. But look through it. Learn your compiler, learn your libraries, learn the settings, learn your tools, that kind of thing. Pre-building JSONs, we talked about this a little bit. I can get into a bit more of an example of what I was talking about. So in the case of like my file system or my searching. So for searching, I do offline searching where I have a tool called Lunar, LUNR, where it's a client side. So when the user tries to search for something, it downloads a JSON file that's like an index of what's searchable, and it finds it based on that, rather than going into a backend and asking some node server to search for stuff. I just ahead of time generate this JSON file that essentially has everything already indexed, and all the user has to do is when they type something in search, that's when it goes and gets the index. And I use it for preloads as well, as you saw in the metadata page where I was loading those 5 link preloads. As you see here, it's only one, but it's based on desktop icons, which is coming from a JSON file. And these JSON files are various files that I make from Node scripts. You could make them however you make scripts. This file system one I actually took from BrowserFS, from the place where I use the file system JavaScript library. They had an example on how to build the JSON file. But in the case of my preload icons or my robot file or the minifying of the HTML, I've basically just utilized Node.js's FS, which I think I have a link for here. So just as a tip for when you're making these scripts in JavaScript, is when you're locally, you can, in the build time, you can use Node.js to run FS commands and actually manipulate the output files. And that's what I'm doing, where I read the file, convert it however I want to convert it, and then just export it back. That's how I'm doing it in this Minify HTML case, where I read the HTML and then I actually parse it with how do I parse it? Oh yeah, there's just a minifier. Wait, how do I parse it? I think I just use string replacement, but I could have parsed it as well had I wanted to. In the case of preload icons, I just look at the folders, my public folders, and I go, okay, well, there's the desktop folder. Here's the files. And then I look in the, I just know how to parse the shortcuts essentially from other functions that I have, basically. So that's just another tip. I mean, you're going to run into this a lot. I've ran into this a lot at work, where I remember one company I had where they had these drop downs of various settings, like let's say for cars it was like Ford, and then okay, well, Ford has F-150s, and then okay, well, we support this. Well, all of what we supported was already known, and it was going to the server SQL, asking it to make a list, getting the list back, converting that to JSON. Essentially, it wasn't necessary. I was able to convert all that to JSON, and in a more efficient way too, because even when you look at some JSON structures that you make, or some structures just in the moment you make so that it can populate a dropdown in React, when you actually look at it, it's like, this is really inefficient. It's repeating this, or the key names are really long. Because when you make that JSON and then you embed it, you've just got this long string repeated 75 times if you got 75 items. Minify that, or make it a list where you don't even use those keys and try to imply those things. Because by doing that, you actually can shrink it by like 100 kilobytes easily, let's say, which can make a massive difference. So that's just a tip in general about anything in React, or where you're trying to make these lists or these object arrays that are essentially static, but you generate them at runtime. Instead, generate those at build time, make JSON files, and either import it in so Webpack makes it part of the bundle, or import it lazy loaded so that it's ready at load time. Either way, typically it's going to be faster to just have the JSON than to try to get a request to get something else that you turn into the JSON. Got another message here from Proful. Anything you do to debug Next.js production bugs, by default Next.js throws blank page and no good log. Yeah, I could give you a quick tip on that, I guess. I don't know if it's a performance thing, but I'll quickly just point you in the right direction. And this is a React thing in general, is that I use these things called error boundaries. And that I found these to be very useful to stop the blank pages. I don't know if you've gone to my site recently. Hopefully it doesn't do as many of those blank pages because of this system of error boundaries that I've created. And basically these error boundaries are at different points in, if a component or something fails in React, it'll fail up to that boundary. And then you can catch it and instead give other HTML. So let's say in the case of what I've done with one of my boundaries is that of a window component. So if that window component fails, it won't can keep going up to crash the entire React app. It'll just fail at that window component. And then I say, okay, if it failed, just put blank HTML in there. Or put HTML that says it failed to render, something like that. I guess you could say that's a secret performance optimization tip, because by capturing your errors, you can, I mean, when the user has an error occur, usually a lot of stuff happens that slows things down, like a pop-up or some kind of things that are happening in the console. So these error boundaries can be a nice way to just catch the errors and do something quick with them at different levels, basically. But yeah, I don't want to get too far into that because that's not so much performance. Let's get into the bundle analyzer now. That's number 19. So the bundle analyzer is another fancy one. I don't run it often with my builds, but I do sometimes. Let's do actually a build right now with the bundle analyzer. I got run build, and I think it's how did I type it? Bundle dash analyzer. Let's hope I typed that correctly. Looks like I did. So that's going to do a build, and it's going to create, it's just a normal build, just like any other, where it creates the HTML. But what it also does is it creates this little graph of where all your bundles have gone, like where Webpack decided to make, to take all the little imports you put. And let's just see. So it's created here. I'm going to put it onto the browser and show everybody. So it's part of Next.js, the one I'm using, so that it works with the Next.js build command, but it's actually part of Webpack. Or it's actually something that you can use, anyone who uses Webpack can use. It's pretty popular, 5 million downloads a week here. So this is the bundle analyzer. And let's go into the bundle here for mine. Hopefully it loads. Yeah, so here's the bundle here. So this looks pretty complicated. If you open up here, you can see all the little chunks and stuff. So what I like to do is I'll go to the code of the HTML, because I only care about the first request. Actually, I can do that a few ways. I can just go to the page here in the network tab, and I can see that actually we can filter too. If we go filter by JavaScript and load it one more time. Oh, I think I had a breakpoint there accidentally. Go back to the network. So here we go. So these are just the JavaScript files that loaded. These specifically are the ones that onload. These two loaded after the fact that are from the web worker, I believe. But what we can do is look at these. I happen to know this one's mostly just Webpack. This is like generic framework stuff. I don't have much control over this. Let's say the first one that matters here, and if we look at the sizes too, we can see which matter. So this one here is 124 kilobytes. If I was going to try to cut something down, let's try to cut that one down. So that's called _app. Okay. So now what we would do is we go to the bundle analyzer, and what I do at least is I uncheck everything, and I just find that app one. Let me try to find it here just from eyeballing it. Can't be that hard. Here it is here. So I just open app, and then I'll just look here, and you'll see, and you get this graph of essentially where all the space is. So the browser, and then you have to kind of know which are important, which ones aren't. So I definitely need the browser file system. I definitely need this main functions file system. Pretty much I just go through these, and you can zoom in on these too and look through it. And you can see every little bundle that gets used, and you can find weird ones. So let's say in this case, let's say if these INIs, let's say if for some reason I knew that there was no need for an INI.js, that library, you know, like I mean, I actually happen to know that it is needed to read the shortcuts, but let's say it wasn't. Then it would be weird that it's there. And then I would go into the code and I would look for, well, how is it getting into the main bundle? Typically, that's going to be an import statement at the top of the file. It's one of those base import statements, not a dynamic one. And what I can do is I can make it dynamic. So I can say, okay, at this point in the code, rather than doing the import up there, I'm going to remove that line and I'm going to put the import here so that when the client, when the browser gets to this line, that's when we'll request that module. And that will remove it from here, and that will make the main bundle smaller, essentially. And that's less for the user to load. So that's the way that I use the bundle analyzer. And then I'll do that for each file. So I'd go to the next file here, 7772, it's called. These were just generated from Next.js. So here's the 772 one. So that's another one that loads on the page load. And I could look at that and see, okay, what are these things? And these are all pretty important. System icons, the scroll bar. So I've already gone through these, and like most of these I'm okay with. This one here, the spotlight effect, this actually doesn't need to be there, but some of them I've decided are better to load at the main thing. Like you don't have to cut everything down. Not everything has to be dynamic, because there's some animations where you want them to work like that, like the millisecond that they're necessary, such as the spotlight effect. I want, as soon as someone hovers over a certain thing where that effect is necessary, it's not going to go do a network request to go tell the cursor how to look to make this visual effect. I want that to already be ready, because that's going to be something the user's going to see right away. So in those cases, you might see things in your bundle where you know that's not being loaded right away, but you want it to be there, basically, because it's there. The lazy loading can only go so far. Like it's gonna incur requests, and we can show you that very easily. So if we the royal we, I meant to say I. I open the page. It's a fresh page. I clear everything. I'm just filtering JavaScript files right now. So now if I open up the start menu, you'll see right away there was a JavaScript file. So that 2020 bundle, that was a separate thing from Webpack that it essentially lazy loaded for some piece of the start menu, let's say. Some piece that wasn't needed on load. And you can go in and look at it, and we could see here. So yeah, it had a bunch of stuff. Oh, it looks like it was mostly CSS in this case. So that might have been the JavaScript that was necessary for my visual updates. And we'll get into the way that I handle CSS and how I try to optimize it and why it's not ideal. Let's move on. Okay, so there's the bundle analyzer. So, we're right at that CSS part now. Number 20 here, inline CSS. Yes. So that's where I wanted to get into. Inline CSS is usually good in my mind. And the idea of what inline CSS is so you see the page first loads here. You have these head elements, which on a typical site, somewhere up in the head here, you're going to have some CSS that loads, like a file, where it's going to request some file.css. And that CSS is going to have some of the stylings. Now, rather than do that, what I typically prefer is for it to be inlined. And what inline means is instead of loading a link script CSS element, is that it just has this style tags right here. And the style is just raw CSS put right into it here, basically. And because I use styled components, which is a type of library, which is a system, we'll get into this in a second, called CSS in JS, where essentially I write my CSS using JavaScript instead of using necessarily the CSS pure syntax. Because of that, it's able to figure out what's going to be needed for the initial page load, plus whatever global rules I wanted, and it creates this style element that inlines most of that ahead of time. And then the rest of the CSS, it's not loaded via files, it's loaded by more JavaScript. So, for example, when I open that start menu, it will run a little bit of JavaScript that adds extra CSS to the DOM to do visual CSS things, but it was triggered by JavaScript because it was all written by JavaScript. And the reason that I do it that way is I personally prefer it this way. There is a small performance hit that you incur. I mean, it's proven. And we'll get into how you can avoid some of that performance hit. But I find from a developer point of view, I much prefer the styled component concept. I mean, there's a few different libraries that where they have this. You use the component paradigm that's with React, but the components themselves have inherent styling that is applied to the CSS of the final product, basically. But the performance hit that you incur is that the browser it's much faster for the browser to read CSS. The browser was built to be able to work with CSS. So if you have a CSS file where everything's CSS and it's already there for it, and all it's waiting for is class names and selectors and ways to parse that, that's faster than instead having JavaScript that's constantly adding CSS to the page and essentially making dynamic adjustments to the CSS. But to me, it's a very small difference. And one of the tools that can help you if you want to go down that route, if you want to try to have the best of both worlds, I haven't personally used it, but there's another one called Linaria here. And it's very similar syntax to styled components. The way that you make a component here, let's say this header, well, in this case, you make a class name. So I guess it's not completely, oh no, here you can make components too. It's got a lot to it anyways, Linaria. But one of the cool things it does is that it will actually create CSS files in the end. So you can write CSS in JS, but then at the build time, it can create actual CSS files versus something like styled components, which has a pretty similar syntax, but it doesn't even try to make CSS files. It doesn't try to pretend that. It just injects things into the here basically to do the styling that it cares about. And it does a bunch of other magic along the way. But from a performance point of view, I don't find it to be a huge hit. And I think you're not squeezing I mean, yeah, you're not going to get a huge amount out of that unless you have a lot of CSS, I feel. But it depends on your CSS level. Another trick here, this is going to be framework dependent. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but just the idea that on script tags, oh, let me switch to the browser. There's another field here called defer. And basically the defer Boolean, what does it say here? The script is meant to be executed after the document has been parsed, but before firing DOM content loaded. So what it allows it to do is that when it's reading this file, it's able to kind of parse this entire HTML file, make all of that initial structure, and then go back and load these deferred scripts before it tells anything else that, hey, I'm loaded. It essentially does HTML, then JavaScript, then load. Versus if this was not to be deferred, then some of that JavaScript could execute along the way. But in the case of Next.js, it's purposely set it up because it knows that's not the way it wants to do it. And that can be for many different reasons. There's this concept called hydration that I don't know a lot about myself personally, but it's something that some of the frameworks use. I'm pretty sure Next.js is using it, where it essentially makes this skeleton of the HTML elements and then it loads the JavaScript to kind of bring it to life or hydrate it, as they say. I've heard some arguments that it's not necessary. Maybe down the road it won't be needed, but these are those things where when I've seen arguments where people will say React is slow, or this is slow, or this is slow, and I'm using a lot of those things, and I have very fast performance, I have to think, okay, well, what's the use case where it's slow for you? Because I'm not having that issue. But there is some truth to it, that there are definitely faster ways to do certain things. So your mileage will vary, and you have to kind of work with what you've got. Another interesting tip I have is the fonts and the system fonts. So in my case of emulating a desktop environment, it made a lot of sense for me to use a specific font face that's the system font. So if you see here for the text, like the word my PC, we hover over Fig Caption here, and we can look at what the font face is. If we look in, let's look at the computed values and go to the font's face, the font family, sorry. So this is the font family that I use in general. Oh yeah, here it's inherited. Let me go back. Where'd I go? I lost it. So the font family that I'm using is this special value. Actually, let's just find the script for it where I'm using it, because it's somewhere in the global. Here it is here. So I call it, I gotta add some space so you can see it here. Oh, and it goes off the screen too. Jeez. Let's just try to show it all here. So Apple system. So these are essentially special names that you can refer to the font faces that will allow it to know, oh, okay, I'll just use the operating system font. And pretty much all of these are equivalent to that. The Apple system one, System UI is one of the more general ones. This Blink Mac one, I believe, is for possibly for old Apple Mac OS. The Segu UI, that's very specific to the Windows one that I ideally would like it to show. And then I try to have it fail gracefully to other sans serif fonts that are all already part of the operating system, such as Roboto, Helvetica Nueve, or Nue, however you pronounce that. And then eventually just sans serif, which is the most generic one. So the reason I mention that is a lot of time people will use Google fonts, or they want to have a slightly different nice font. But the system fonts are actually not so bad. And the system fonts actually have a lot of control. Like if you look at some of the modern features of CSS, I don't have links to them necessarily. Let's go into font family and just quickly peek at what kind of font suggestions they have. There's so many font settings now that if you use one of these system fonts, and they talk about using the system fonts, I believe. Yeah, they mention here how it's the system UI one exists. But you can do more adjustments to the system fonts because they're actually a bit more powerful versus using a Google font where it tries to go out of its way to use the most limited possible font to save you bandwidth. It might just be better to use one of the system fonts. You might lose some consistency, and that's where you have to pick which font you might want to use. But by using the embedded the fonts that already exist versus bringing a font in, you typically are gonna have a better performance, I would say, for several reasons. There's a few different. There's one called like Fout or something, FOUT, flash of unstyled content or something like that. I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but there's these different acronyms for these little visuals you see where the text will look one way, and then when your font loads, oh, now it looks another way. Just a minor one, but they're very hard to avoid without different fallbacks or methods or weighting systems, algorithms, because you have to load that font. But when you pick these system fonts, you essentially have you've already got the fonts there. And this is a site that kind of talks about the system font stack and how it's kind of good, fast, no network requests, has different styles, has the familiarity, and they suggest different stacks you can do that kind of have different fallbacks that are very similar to the one I'm using. They have a few other suggested ones that I'm not sure I would necessarily pick. I would much rather this Segu UI one because I'm trying to make it look like Windows. So if you have this font, great, please use it. Typically is what I'm saying. But I know in the case of the Apple ones, it's not going to have it. I don't know what this is though. Anyways, that's another little tip. I see a lot of people using custom fonts that are like, it's pretty minor. For the bandwidth it saves you. Here's another little tip. I sometimes forget that I use this, and I'm not sure how much it helps, but I think it's worth adding because I don't think it's the default, is with the image tags, there is a value called decoding. If you see here with my image tags, I'm using it, decoding as asynchronous. And yeah, I'm pretty sure that the default is not async. The default is auto, and I don't like to leave it in the hands of the browser whenever I can. So if you say async, then it'll decode the images asynchronously to reduce delay in presenting other content. That sounds better. So I would never want it to default to synchronous unless I was making some kind of app where that image is like all that matters. It's like, just wait for this. This is all I care about showing. Other than that, it's like, hey, let's load whatever else you can around while we're waiting for this. Fine. So that's another little tip, is to just add that decoding async to your images. I find that's just that's just like straightforward. Just do it if you can, I guess. Then we get into, a bit more into responsive images. We've kind of talked about it a bit with the image source set, and this MDM article goes into it a lot more. But basically, there's a way to do it beyond the familiar IMG image tag that we know of, called this picture tag, which is kind of the more modern way to write these image elements. And the typical structure of it is that it's going to have the picture, the wrapper. It's going to have the image tag that you're familiar with. That's considered a lot of the fallback, a lot of the events that occur. You can add to this thing, such as the onload, that kind of thing. And then it's also going to have various amounts of these source elements. And these allow you to specify the different responsive images you want. And this is where I have a little more control over the images than I do with a link tag. So if we see here for this image here, I'm going to have a bit more of my monster here. It's done. Back. I got to move to water now. So you'll see here I have a picture element. And we have our usual image tag with a lot of stuff that we saw in the link header, such as the image source set. Here it's just called source set, but it's the same that same string where it's got the 1x, the 2x, the 3x. This is the fallback if that was what they supported. But ideally, what I would want is these three sources here that are doing the same thing, the 1, the 2, the 3, but they have a little more extra logic that I've added. Other than that, this image has nothing we haven't discussed already. Fetch priority. That's really it. The styling, you don't have to worry about that. That's not related to performance. Loading eager. All right, we've discussed that as well. It's specific to versus lazy loading versus eager loading. For these 4 items, I've gone out of my way to say load these eagerly. Don't think about lazy loading them. Just load it as soon as possible. So there's so many different settings I've put to try to make these images a priority, basically. Going to the source tags here, I wanted to discuss quickly one little tweak I've done. So what I've done here, and this is to allow, if someone were to go to my page and then zoom in, if I were to just use the basic source set where it's 1x, 2x, 3x, then it essentially it never updates the image. If you were just to zoom in all the way up to what would be essentially 3x, it's not going to show you 3x unless you refresh the page. But if you add media queries, which I've done to these source elements here, then the media queries will constantly check to make sure to see if the state of your browser has changed. So then what I've done here is I've said if the minimum resolution is even 1%, 0.01x above of a 1x, then we're just going to use the 2x images. So then you get a crisper image as you zoom to the next level. That's a little fine detail that I've added that's not necessarily there by default. And the reason I've used this 1.01x, there is a syntax called like greater than, where you can say greater than 1x, but the greater than has very little browser support. So I've decided to use this slightly ugly version of doing 0.01, which is kind of arbitrary. So if they somehow have a DPI that's 1.001, it wouldn't change the image, but I don't know if that scenario would ever occur. So I've just decided to do it that way to have some kind of level to say above 1, basically. And I've done that for the 3x one as well. So even the slightest little bit above 2x, just to show the 3x one, and that's what it'll show beyond anything. So that's the way that I've done a more responsive image. And yeah, that's the basics of that, actually. And we're at the last one, which I've actually kind of gone over already a little bit, but involving that cumulative layout shift and the fact that you don't want any shifting to occur. That's where they kind of get into it in some of these articles here, and this is changing all the time how they measure this cumulative layout shift. But one of the key features, or the key factors to it, is making sure that your markup, the things you're showing, don't resize, don't change based on the loading of things. Don't shift based on that. And the way that I've found to do that has been most of the time, like with these images, I know the size of them. I know that they're these controlled images where the 1x is 48 by 48, the 2x is 96 by 96. So I'm able to go in and you see here an image. I've specified height, I specify width every time. And that will prevent any kind of layout shift.
And another method, another thing that actually has somewhat broad support that you can do if you're not sure on both the dimensions, but you're sure on one of them, is you can use this other CSS feature called aspect ratio. So let's say, I mean, I don't know what, I guess for some reason, if you knew that you have the width, but you don't have the height, you could just say the aspect ratio is 1:1. So then you say the width is 48 pixels. So then the height is essentially inferred, and it's going to make that layout space for it. So you're not going to have that shift. But yeah, whew, that's it. I think we've just gone through everything. I think that's 25 things. So yeah, thank you for staying with me this long. If you like this video, please throw me a like. If you like my channel, please subscribe. I'm going to keep trying to do videos like this. Quickly go over a few more chats just before I leave. Just some people saying hi, basically. I think I've actually addressed most of the comments and questions, so I'm happy to say I did that. Feel free to leave more comments in the YouTube comments. And yeah, if like I said, if you like what I'm doing, please stay tuned for the next one, because I'm always making videos like this. And thanks for checking this one out. And I'll see you in the next one then. So goodbye.